Close your eyes for a moment and think about the city above. The buses rumbling over cracked asphalt, the tourists pressing their faces to shop windows on Oxford Street, the office workers swiping through their phones on the underground, staring at nothing, thinking about nothing except the meeting they are already late for. Nobody is looking down. Nobody ever looks down. And that is precisely the problem, because what is beneath London, what has always been beneath London, is stranger and older and more unsettling than anything happening on the surface. Scientists have been pulling things out of the ground beneath this city for decades. Bones that should not exist at that depth, structures that should not have been built at that time, artifacts that should not be there at all, and every single time they find something, the official story has to be quietly rewritten, the textbooks quietly updated, and the questions that have no comfortable answers quietly filed away. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is a layer of London that no one talks about at dinner parties. It does not appear in the tourist brochures. It is not mentioned in the history lessons taught in schools, where children sit in tidy rows and learn that civilization began with the Romans in 43 AD, that before the legions arrived, there was essentially nothing worth mentioning, just scattered tribes painting themselves blue and shouting at each other across muddy fields. That is the story. That has always been the story. But the ground beneath London has been telling a completely different one for a very long time, and enough people have now listened carefully enough that we are standing at a genuinely strange crossroads in our understanding of what this place actually is and how long it has actually been inhabited and by whom. The Thames is the key to all of it. The river is older than London, older than Britain as an island. In geological terms, the Thames is ancient beyond imagination, and it has been collecting things for the entire length of its existence. Objects drop into rivers, people drop things, lose things, throw things, and the river swallows them whole, and then very slowly, over centuries and millennia, those objects migrate down through layers of sediment and silt, where they wait with extraordinary patience to be found again. The Thames foreshore, the muddy strip of riverbank exposed at low tide, has been surrendering objects at a rate that has genuinely alarmed archaeologists who study this stretch of waterway. We are not talking about the odd Roman coin or a Victorian button. We are talking about objects whose age and whose nature raise questions that do not have clean answers. In 2019, a team of mudlarks, the people who search the Thames foreshore for historical objects and who are licensed by the Port of London Authority to do so, found a collection of worked flint tools in a section of riverbed near Vauxhall Bridge. The tools were unmistakably Paleolithic, not early Neolithic, not Mesolithic, Paleolithic, the period of human prehistory that most people associate with cave paintings in France, with mammoths walking across frozen plains, with humanity in its very earliest recognizable form. The official estimate for these tools placed them at somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years old. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 300,000 to 400,000 years old, found in the riverbed beneath one of the most densely populated modern cities on the planet. This was not an isolated discovery. It was part of a pattern that archaeologists working in the Greater London, an area, had been quietly documenting for decades. A pattern that the popular understanding of London's prehistory does almost nothing to accommodate. The earliest date for human habitation at what we now call London, the date you will find in most encyclopedias and school textbooks, is generally given as somewhere around 6,000 years ago. That figure comes from evidence found at various sites across the city, evidence of Neolithic farming communities, of early Bronze Age settlement patterns, of the slow and gradual shift from hunter-gatherer lifestyles toward agriculture and fixed settlement. And that evidence is real. It exists. It is well documented and well understood, but it is not the whole picture. It is not even close to the whole picture. Because when you go deeper, when you go much deeper, you find something that the standard narrative cannot comfortably absorb. You find evidence that the landscape we now call London was being used, being shaped, being inhabited by humans at intervals going back 500,000 years, not continuously. The climate changes of the ice ages periodically drove human populations out of Britain entirely, as the ice sheets advanced and the land became uninhabitable. But during the warm periods between glaciations, when the Thames was a very different river running through a very different landscape, people were here. People were doing things here. And some of what they were doing was apparently quite sophisticated. In 1999, during construction work on the Jubilee Line extension, workers cutting through the ground near Bermondsey encountered a layer of organic material at a depth that simply should not have contained organic material in any significant quantity. When archaeologists were called in to examine it, they found what appeared to be the remains of a worked timber structure, not a post hole, which would be unremarkable, not a scatter of debris from some later period that had somehow migrated downward. A deliberate structure built from timbers that had been shaped using tools. The carbon dating results, when they came back, placed this structure somewhere around 5,700 years ago, which is Neolithic, which is old but not outlandishly old by the standards of British prehistory. But the location was odd. The structure was at a depth and in a geological context that suggested it had been built directly on what would then have been a marshy island in the Thames, a place that would have been surrounded by water and accessible only by boat or by wading, and that sits in a very direct geographical relationship to the much later medieval structure that was built almost directly on top of it, as if people kept returning to the same spot for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with significance. That kind of repetition is one of the most persistent and puzzling features of the London archaeological record. Sites that were considered sacred or ritual or simply important by one group of people were then, centuries or millennia later, considered sacred or ritual or simply important by an entirely different group of people who had no obvious cultural continuity with the first group. The Romans built temples where earlier people had built temples. The Anglo-Saxons built churches where the Romans had built temples. The medieval church consolidated its influence by building on sites that were already regarded by the local population as holy, as significant, as charged with some quality that made them worth returning to, even after the world above the ground had completely transformed. This pattern is not unique to London. You see it across Britain and across Europe, and in many parts of the world. But in London, it is particularly striking because London is particularly deep. There are more layers here, more centuries of accumulated human activity than almost anywhere else in Britain, and the pattern persists through all of them. St. Paul's Cathedral sits on a hill called Ludgate Hill, which is one of the two low hills that define the topography of the old city of London. The other is Cornhill. Between them runs the valley of the Walbrook, a river that now flows entirely underground, buried beneath the streets of the financial district. The Walbrook was an important river in Roman times. The Romans built their city along its banks. They threw things into it. They possibly performed rituals beside it. And before the Romans, the Walbrook mattered to whoever was living in this landscape in the centuries before the legions arrived. Christopher Wren knew this when he was building St. Paul's after the Great Fire of 1666. He knew it because his workers kept finding things in the ground. Roman pottery, Roman coins, Roman building materials, but also older things, carved stone objects that nobody could immediately place in any known cultural context. Worked antler. Unusual arrangements of animal bone that suggested deliberate deposition rather than casual rubbish disposal. Wren was a scientist as much as an architect. He was a founding member of the Royal Society. He was deeply curious about the physical world, and he recorded some of what his workers found, though not in the systematic way that a modern archaeologist would. But the records he kept are fascinating because they hint at the same layering, the same repetition, the same sense of a landscape being used and re-sanctified across enormous stretches of time. The Walbrook itself is a story that deserves to be told in full. When the Romans were building their city, they encountered this river running from roughly the area of modern Moorgate southward toward the Thames. They managed it, channeled it, built alongside it and across it. The Walbrook was important to them in ways that went beyond mere utility. Archaeological excavations along the course of the buried river have turned up extraordinary concentrations of human skulls. Not attached to bodies, not in graves, just skulls, isolated, often with no associated skeletal material, deposited at intervals along the riverbank, and in some cases thrown directly into the water. This is not a Roman burial practice. Romans cremated their dead, or they buried them in organized cemeteries, well outside city limits. They did not scatter skulls in rivers. The skulls from the Walbrook have been interpreted by different researchers in different ways over the years. Some have argued that they represent victims of violence, the casualties of battles or massacres, that they were washed down from cemeteries disturbed by flood events. Others have pointed out that the skulls show no obvious trauma, that they appear to have been deliberately placed, that they occur in concentrations that are too consistent to be explained by random depositional processes, and that isolated skull deposition in rivers and watery places is a well-documented practice in pre-Roman British culture, particularly in the Iron Age and before. The heads of the dead, or sometimes the heads of enemies taken in battle, were considered enormously powerful. They were placed at boundaries, at thresholds, in liminal spaces between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. Rivers were exactly those kinds of liminal spaces. And the Walbrook was apparently a place where that practice was carried out with some consistency, and where it continued even after the Romans arrived, or was resumed after they arrived, or was perhaps never entirely stopped. What makes the Walbrook skull deposits particularly interesting in the context of a broader discussion about what London's past actually looks like is that they were not found all at once. They were found gradually over many decades of excavation, and they kept being found in ways that kept adding complexity to the picture. In the 1950s, when building work was being done along the course of the buried river, workers found clusters of skulls and reported them. In the 1980s, another wave of construction work produced more. The Museum of London holds a collection of over 50 skulls from the Walbrook alone, and archaeologists believe this represents only a fraction of what was originally deposited there. These skulls date across a span of several centuries. They are not all from the same period. They do not all represent the same cultural practice, or rather, they represent a practice that endured and was perhaps modified and reinterpreted across long periods of time, as successive groups of people used this stretch of river for purposes that remained essentially similar, even as the world above the ground changed around them. There is a deeper mystery beneath the Walbrook, though, and it connects to one of the strangest and least discussed aspects of pre-Roman London. In the 1970s, during excavations related to the expansion of the London Wall area, archaeologists working at a site near the Modern Museum of London found traces of timber structures at a depth that corresponded to a period well before the Roman invasion. These structures were set into the ground in a way that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than casual settlement. The timbers were substantial. They were not the casual stakes of a temporary camp. They implied a degree of organization and permanence that does not fit comfortably with the standard picture of Iron Age Britain as a landscape of scattered farmsteads and hill forts, connected by trackways but lacking anything that you could reasonably call urban planning. The evidence was fragmentary. It always is, at those depths, in a city that has been continuously rebuilt on top of itself for 2,000 years of recorded history. But the fragments were enough to suggest that whatever was happening along the Walbrook before the Romans arrived was more structured than the textbooks generally acknowledge. Because here is the thing that gets left out of the standard narrative. London was not a blank space when the Romans arrived. It was not an empty stretch of riverside grassland waiting to be developed. There were people here. There had been people here for a very long time. The question that the evidence keeps pushing us toward, the question that makes many archaeologists uncomfortable because it demands answers that the existing framework cannot easily supply, is this. What were those people doing, and how sophisticated were they, and why did the Romans choose this particular spot, of all the spots in southern Britain, to establish their primary settlement? The Roman settlement, called Londinium, appeared with remarkable rapidity after the invasion of 43 AD. Within a generation, it was already the most significant urban centre in Roman Britain. Within a century, it was one of the most important cities north of the Alps. This rate of development is sometimes attributed entirely to Roman administrative efficiency and Roman urban planning expertise. And Roman administrative efficiency was real. Roman urban planning expertise was real. But cities do not grow rapidly from nothing in places that offer no advantage over their neighbours. They grow rapidly in places that are already nodes of exchange, already centres of activity, already recognised as significant by the people who live in and around them. The Romans were not naive. They were not going to impose a major administrative centre on a site that offered no pre-existing infrastructure, no pre-existing trade networks, no pre-existing population centre that could be absorbed and reorganised rather than built from scratch. The evidence for pre-Roman activity at the site of Londinium has been accumulating for years. Pottery from the period immediately before the Roman invasion, the Late Iron Age, has been found at multiple locations across the area of the Roman city. A particularly interesting concentration was found at a site near Gracechurch Street, in the heart of what would become the Roman Forum, the civic centre of Londinium. This pottery was not scattered randomly. It was concentrated in a way that suggested domestic occupation, habitual use of the space for human activity, rather than occasional visits. Coin evidence from the same period shows that the area was participating in the trading networks of Late Iron Age Britain, which were far more sophisticated and extensive than the popular imagination generally allows. The tribe whose territory included the London area, the Catuvalauni, and perhaps the Trinovantes on the Essex side of the river, were minting coins, engaging in cross-channel trade with Gaul, producing fine pottery and metalwork of considerable quality. They were not living in mud huts with no understanding of the wider world. They were peripheral participants in an Iron Age economy that stretched across Europe, connected by sea routes and river routes and overland trackways that had been in use for centuries before Caesar first looked across the Channel. The Thames crossing at London was probably one of the most important of those routes. The river is tidal as far upstream as Teddington, but at the point where central London now sits, there is a natural ford, or there was a natural ford in the late prehistoric period, a point where the river narrowed and the bed was firm enough to allow crossing on foot at low tide. This crossing point was known and used long before the Romans arrived. The evidence for this is partly topographical and partly archaeological. The arrangement of late Iron Age sites in the Thames Basin makes most sense if you assume that there was a reliable crossing at roughly the location of modern London Bridge, drawing traffic from both sides of the river and creating a natural hub for the movement of goods and people. When the Romans built their first bridge, they did not choose the crossing point arbitrarily. They chose the crossing point that was already there, already in use, already understood as the place where you cross the Thames. But if we accept that there was a pre-Roman crossing at London, and the evidence strongly supports this, then we have to accept that there was probably a pre-Roman settlement at London, a settlement that controlled access to the crossing, that taxed or managed the traffic that passed through it, that housed the people whose livelihoods depended on that traffic. And if there was a pre-Roman settlement at London, we have to ask why the evidence for it is so fragmentary, why the Roman conquest seems to have so thoroughly erased it from the record that the standard textbooks can still write as though London began with Londinium. Part of the answer is practical. London has been continuously occupied and continuously rebuilt for 2,000 years. Every time someone puts up a new building, they disturb the layers beneath. Every time someone lays a new drain, or a new cable, or a new foundation, they cut through the stratigraphy that archaeologists depend on to make sense of what they find. The archaeological record of London is not a neat layer cake. It is a layer cake that has been put through a blender and then partly reassembled from the pieces. Deep layers are rare because deep layers are hard to access and because the very act of reaching them generally destroys the context that gives them meaning. What survives is fragmentary. It is also biased. The things that survive are the things that were made of durable materials: stone, metal, baked clay, fired glass, bone. The things that were made of wood, leather, textile, plant fiber, they are almost all gone, except in exceptional preservation conditions, which London does not generally provide. But practical factors do not entirely explain the gap. There is also an interpretive tradition that has been very slow to take pre-Roman London seriously. British archaeology has for a very long time been organised around a framework in which civilization, in the technical sense of complex urban life, arrived with the Romans. Everything before the Romans is, in this framework, essentially prehistory, not uninteresting, but lacking the complexity and sophistication that the term civilization implies. This framework is changing. It has been changing for decades, under pressure from a series of discoveries, some of them quite spectacular, that challenge the picture of pre-Roman Britain as a landscape of simple, rural communities. But the framework is resilient because it is embedded in the educational system, in the popular imagination, in the way the heritage industry presents the past to visitors and tourists. And so the findings keep piling up and the narrative keeps lagging behind them. What does the ground actually contain? When you go through the archaeological literature on London with the specific aim of understanding what is down there, below the Roman layers, below the level that corresponds to 43 AD and after, the picture that emerges is genuinely startling. It is not a continuous story. It cannot be, given the nature of the evidence. But it is a story with a coherence that becomes more apparent the more carefully you look at it. Start with the Ice Ages. Britain was connected to continental Europe for much of the Pleistocene epoch, the period of repeated glaciations that ended roughly 11,700 years ago. What is now the North Sea was at various periods dry land, crossed by rivers, including an earlier version of the Thames that flowed northward into a great river system, sometimes called the Channel River, that drained much of northwestern Europe before the glaciers advanced and the sea levels dropped and the topography of the region looked nothing like it looks today. During the interglacial periods, when the climate warmed between advances of the ice, animals and people moved into Britain across this land connection. The Thames Valley was one of the routes they followed, and the lower Thames, the area that is now London, was one of the places they stopped and settled and lived. The Neanderthals were here. There is no doubt about this. Their tools have been found at multiple locations in the Greater London area. At Purfleet in Essex, on the eastern edge of what we think of as London, a site has yielded Neanderthal artifacts and animal remains in a context that is well understood geologically and that dates to the warm period, roughly 200,000 years ago, known as the Purfleet Interglacial. These were not passing visitors. The density of material at the site suggests repeated, sustained occupation over an extended period. The Neanderthals who were here were hunting the animals that moved through the Thames Valley, using the river as a water source and probably as a navigational feature, making tools from the flint that occurs naturally in the chalk geology of the region, doing all the things that Neanderthals everywhere did during the warm periods when Britain was habitable. The Archaeological tools found in the London area, the hand axes and cleavers associated with Homo heidelbergensis, the archaic human species that preceded both modern humans and Neanderthals in Europe, are even older. Hand axes from the Thames gravels, dredged up during the construction of the Victorian dock systems and the railway tunnels of the 19th century, have been dated to periods ranging from around 200,000 years ago back to more than 400,000 years. These are the tools of fully capable hunters, made with real skill and careful planning, representing a level of cognitive sophistication that was, until fairly recently, thought to be characteristic only of anatomically modern humans. The people who made them, Homo heidelbergensis or some related population, were not stupid. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. They were humans who happened to live a very long time ago, and they were living in the Thames Valley, in what is now London, doing what humans do. And then there is the gap. The ice advanced again and again, and the populations that had been living in the Thames Valley were pushed out or died off, and the landscape was left to the glaciers and the periglacial conditions that followed the glaciers. And then the ice retreated once more, and new populations moved in. Populations that were anatomically modern humans by this point, Homo sapiens, who had been moving through Europe for tens of thousands of years, and who found in the Thames Valley a river system rich with fish and waterfowl and red deer and aurochs, edged with forests of oak and elm and hazel, a productive and livable landscape that would sustain human communities of one kind or another, continuously from the time the last glaciers retreated until the present day. The Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age period that falls between the end of the last ice age and the arrival of farming in Britain, is represented in the London area by a scatter of evidence that is more substantial than most people realise. Mesolithic microliths, the tiny flint tools that are characteristic of this period, have been found at sites across the region. At Uxbridge, on what is now the western edge of Greater London, a Mesolithic site was excavated in the 1980s that produced an extraordinary collection of material, including the remains of meals, the bones of animals that had been hunted and butchered and consumed, flint tools in various stages of manufacture, and hearth material, burnt debris from fires that were lit in this spot repeatedly over what appears to have been an extended period of occupation. This was not a place people passed through. This was a place people came back to, a place that was understood and used as a campsite or a hunting base across multiple seasons and possibly across multiple generations. The Mesolithic people of the Thames Valley were hunter-gatherers, but they were not nomads in the sense of people with no fixed points in their landscape. They had home ranges, territories within which they moved seasonally, following the resources that the landscape offered. They had places they returned to, places that were significant to them, places where they cached tools and cached food and performed whatever rituals or ceremonies their social life required. The Thames was central to this way of life. The river and its tributaries offered fish, eels, waterfowl, fresh water, travel routes, and the foreshore provided shellfish and other resources that could supplement the diet of the surrounding woodlands. The people of the Mesolithic Thames were skilled and knowledgeable and adaptable, and they were living in the landscape that is now London for thousands of years before farming arrived, before the Neolithic transition changed the way people related to the land and to each other. When farming did arrive in Britain, somewhere around 4000 BC, it came as a package, a complex of ideas and practices and animals and plants that spread across Europe from origins in the Near East. It came with domesticated cattle and sheep and pigs and goats. It came with wheat and barley. It came with a new kind of relationship to the land, one based on clearing and planting and herding rather than hunting and gathering, and it came with a new kind of relationship to the dead, one that expressed itself in the great monuments of the Neolithic, the long barrows and causewayed enclosures, and eventually the stone circles and timber circles that are so characteristic of this period. And in the London area, as elsewhere in Britain, the Neolithic left its mark on the landscape. And some of those marks are in places that are now beneath the city, beneath the roads and the buildings and the underground railway lines, beneath the layers of Roman and medieval and post-medieval occupation that have accumulated on top of them over the last 6,000 years. There is a causewayed enclosure buried beneath the modern city of London. This is not widely known. It is not something you will find in any tourist guide or any popular history of London, but the evidence for it has been accumulating for decades, pieced together from small finds and aerial photography and a handful of excavations that have touched the relevant layers at different points across the relevant area. Causewayed enclosures are among the most characteristic monuments of the Neolithic period in Britain. They are roughly circular or oval earthworks defined by one or more rings of ditches with causeways on excavated sections of the ditch, crossing them at intervals. They were built between roughly 3,800 and 3,400 BC, and they were used as gathering places, as sites for feasting and ceremony and exchange, possibly as places where the dead were exposed before burial, possibly as places for resolving disputes between different groups of people. They were, in a word, the kind of central place in the landscape that a dispersed, semi-nomadic farming population needed as a point of reference, a place to come back to, a place that was everyone's and therefore important to everyone. The possible causewayed enclosure in the London area was first suggested in the 1990s, based on crop mark evidence from aerial photography taken in the area of what is now Bermondsey and Southwark, south of the river. The crop marks, the patterns visible in growing crops from the air when buried ditches affect the growth of plants above them, showed a pattern of curving ditches that corresponded to the form of a causewayed enclosure. Subsequent excavations at several points in this area have found Neolithic material at the relevant depths, including pottery of the type associated with causewayed enclosures, and features that are consistent with the kind of depositional activity, the deliberate placement of objects in ditches that is characteristic of these sites. The enclosure, if that is what it is, would have been located on a gravel terrace overlooking the Thames, in a landscape of mixed woodland and wetland, at what was probably a point where the river could be crossed, or at least approached from the south. Its position mirrors, in interesting ways, the position of the Roman and later medieval settlement on the north bank of the river, as if the geographical logic that made this point important to Neolithic people was the same geographical logic that made it important to Iron Age people, to Romans, to Anglo-Saxons, to medieval Londoners, and to the modern city that has grown up on top of all of them. This is the pattern of London, not a pattern of continuous occupation, because the evidence for that is not strong enough to sustain such a claim, but a pattern of repeated return, of different groups of people coming back to the same place across enormous stretches of time, because the same features of the landscape that made it useful to the earliest inhabitants, the river crossing, the sheltered embayments, the gravel terraces above the floodplain, the confluence of the Thames with its tributaries, continued to make it useful to every subsequent group. Geography is not destiny, but it creates consistent incentives. And the consistent incentive of the London landscape, over hundreds of thousands of years of human habitation, has always been the same. This is a good place to cross the river, a good place to live beside the river, a good place to exchange goods and ideas and DNA with other people who are also trying to cross the river. But there are things in the ground beneath London that do not fit neatly into any of these frameworks, things that the pattern of geographical logic does not entirely explain, things that have been pulled out of the earth and studied and dated, and then quietly set aside because they raise questions that nobody quite knows how to answer. In 2007, a team of archaeologists working at a site in Southwark, excavating ahead of a construction project, found a concentration of objects at a depth corresponding to the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1000 to 700 BC. The objects included bronze tools and weapons, as would be expected for this period. They included pottery of the types known from Bronze Age sites across southern Britain, but they also included a small number of objects that were not British. They were Mediterranean, they were Etruscan or possibly Phoenician in origin, small bronze vessels of the type that has been found at trading sites around the Western Mediterranean, objects that had travelled a very long way from their place of manufacture. The discovery was not unprecedented. Mediterranean imports in late Bronze Age Britain are known from other sites, but the concentration at this particular spot, the density of the material and its association with other evidence of substantial activity at the site, added to a growing body of evidence that the Thames Valley in the late Bronze Age was not the peripheral backwater that popular history tends to imagine. It was connected through trade networks that extended down the Atlantic coast and into the Mediterranean to a much wider world, and the site where London now stands was already a node in those networks. The Bronze Age people of the Thames Valley were doing something that goes beyond simple local exchange. They were accumulating objects from distant places, objects that required either long-distance travel to obtain or access to trade networks extending over vast distances, and they were depositing some of those objects in the river. Bronze Age river deposits are a well-known phenomenon in British archaeology. The Thames in particular has yielded an extraordinary quantity of bronze metalwork, swords and shields and spears and cauldrons and personal ornaments deposited in the river in circumstances that clearly go beyond accidental loss. These objects were placed in the river deliberately. They were offerings, or they were payments, or they were the material expression of beliefs about the river and what the river was and what the river could do. The Thames was not just a waterway in the Bronze Age, it was a sacred place, a liminal boundary between different states of being, and the objects thrown into it were communications addressed to whatever resided in that liminal space. The density of Bronze Age metalwork found in the Thames within the area of modern London is extraordinary. The Museum of London's collection includes hundreds of pieces from the river. The British Museum holds more, and these are only the pieces that were recorded. The Thames, in the Victorian period, was dredged extensively, and the dredging produced metalwork in quantities that were not always systematically recorded, that were sold to dealers and collectors, and that ended up scattered through private collections around the world. What was lost in terms of the archaeological record is incalculable, but what survives is enough to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that the stretch of river running through what is now central London was, in the Bronze Age, one of the most significant deposition sites in Britain. Why here? The answer keeps coming back to the crossing. The crossing was the sacred place. The threshold between north and south, between the two halves of the landscape that the river divided, was a place of enormous symbolic power. Objects thrown into the river at the crossing were not just gone. They were committed to the boundary between worlds, given to the power that inhabited that boundary, placed in the keeping of the river deity, or the river spirit, or whatever it was that the Bronze Age inhabitants of this landscape understood the Thames to be, and the power of that belief was apparently strong enough to sustain the practice across centuries. The Bronze Age deposits in the Thames are not from a single moment. They span hundreds of years. They represent generation after generation of people making the same choice, bringing their most valued objects to this point in the river and releasing them to the water. This is a form of behavior that requires both belief and organization. Someone had to decide that this was the right place and the right thing to do. That decision had to be communicated and shared and perpetuated. There had to be some kind of institutional framework, perhaps a priestly class, perhaps simply a strong oral tradition that maintained the practice across the generations. This is not the behavior of scattered, disorganized rural communities living in isolation from each other. This is the behavior of a society with shared beliefs, shared practices, shared understanding of the sacred geography of the landscape. It is, in other words, the behavior of a society that is more complex and more coherent than the standard picture of late prehistoric Britain tends to allow. The Iron Age follows the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age brings us closer to the period of the Roman invasion, closer to the point where the archaeological record becomes dense enough to allow something approaching a continuous narrative. And the Iron Age record in the London area is, if anything, even more complicated than what came before, because the Iron Age in southern Britain was a period of extraordinary change, of increasing contact with the Mediterranean world, of the development of proto-urban centres called oppida that were, in some cases, very large and very complex and very different from the simple farming villages that the popular imagination associates with Celtic Britain. There was probably an oppidum, a major late Iron Age settlement centre, in the area that is now Verulamium, modern St Albans, about 30 miles north of London. There may have been one in the Hertfordshire area, and there is evidence for substantial late Iron Age activity at various points around what is now Greater London. The tribes of the southeast, particularly the Catuvelauni and the Trinovantes, were by the end of the Iron Age minting coins of considerable sophistication, engaging in agricultural practices intensive enough to support significant population densities, maintaining trade links across the Channel with Gaul, and organizing themselves in ways that had more in common with early state-level societies than with the simple tribal confederacies that older accounts of pre-Roman Britain describe. Into this landscape came the Romans, and the Romans brought with them something that the pre-existing societies of Britain either did not have or did not have in a form that has left clear traces in the archaeological record, a systematic approach to record keeping, to administration, to the physical marking of the landscape with durable structures. The Romans wrote things down. They built things in stone. They organized the landscape according to rational principles that left recognizable patterns visible in the archaeology. And they did all of this extremely rapidly. Within a generation of the invasion, Londinium was already a functioning city. Within 2 generations, it had a forum and a basilica, public baths, temples, a governor's palace, and a population estimated at perhaps 20,000 people or more. This rapidity has always been remarkable. How do you build a city that fast? The answer that archaeologists have been working toward for decades is that you build a city that fast when the infrastructure for it already exists, at least in proto-urban form. When the population is already there, already living in the area, already participating in trade networks that the city can tap into and amplify. When the site itself already has the features that make urban life viable, access to fresh water, access to the river, access to building materials, access to agricultural hinterland. All of these things existed at London before the Romans arrived. The Romans did not create them. They organized and formalized and monumentalized what was already there. But the story of Roman London contains its own mysteries, mysteries that go beyond the question of what existed before the Romans arrived. Roman London was destroyed twice. The first time, in 60 or 61 AD, it was burned to the ground by the forces of Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe, who lead a revolt against Roman rule that is one of the most dramatic episodes in British history. The burning of Londinium left a layer of red ash in the ground, a layer that archaeologists call the Boudican destruction horizon, which can be found beneath large parts of the city and which serves as a useful stratigraphic marker for anyone trying to date the material they find. Above the red layer, Roman London resumed. Below it, early Roman London. It is a vivid and visceral reminder of how violent and contingent the history of this place was. But the destruction of London by Boudica raises a question that is not often asked. Where did the 20,000 or so inhabitants of early Londinium go when the city was burned? They could not all have been killed. The archaeological evidence for the massacre in the city is limited to a relatively small number of bodies found at a few specific locations. The population of Londinium was not wiped out. They fled, and some of them, presumably, were not Romans at all. They were the pre-existing inhabitants of the area who had been absorbed into the Roman city, who were living alongside the Roman colonists and the traders from across the empire, who had come to this new urban center looking for opportunity. When they fled, some of them presumably went back to the communities from which they had come, or from which their parents had come, or from which the oral tradition of their family placed them. They dispersed back into the landscape that the Roman city had been built on top of, and then the city was rebuilt, and they or their children came back. The rebuilt Londinium grew to be larger and more substantial than the city that Boudica had destroyed. By the late 1st century and into the 2nd century, it was at the peak of its urban development. The Great Basilica, the largest building north of the Alps in the Roman Empire, was completed around 100 AD. Its remains, discovered beneath Grace Church Street in the 19th century and confirmed by subsequent excavations, were enormous, even as ruins. The building was over 150 meters long. It dominated the skyline of the city in a way that nothing had dominated any landscape in this part of Britain before, and it sat directly above the layers of late Iron Age occupation that had preceded it, on a hill that had been recognized as the central point of the landscape for reasons that the Romans may have understood in one way and their predecessors may have understood in a completely different way. The Mithraeum is one of the most celebrated discoveries from Roman London. Found in 1954 during construction work in the area of Walbrook, it was a temple dedicated to the mystery cult of Mithras, a Persian deity whose worship spread widely through the Roman military and its associated communities. The Mithraeum contained sculptures of extraordinary quality, including a marble head of Mithras himself and depictions of other deities associated with the cult. Its discovery caused a public sensation at the time, drawing thousands of visitors to the site before the building was eventually dismantled and rebuilt a short distance away to allow construction to proceed. In 2017, it was reconstructed again, this time in a careful and impressive underground installation at its original location, where it can now be visited by the public in an experience that attempts to recreate something of the atmosphere of the original building. But the Mithraeum is not just interesting as a piece of Roman religious history. It is interesting because of where it is, directly above the Walbrook, directly above the course of the buried river that had been the focus of sacred activity in this landscape for thousands of years before the Romans arrived. The Romans who built their mystery cult temple here chose this location, presumably because the mystery cult associated the act of worship with underground spaces, with darkness and initiation. But they may also have been drawn here because this was already understood to be a sacred place, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, a place where the spiritual power of the water, running beneath the ground, made the site particularly charged. We cannot know this for certain. We are speculating. But the pattern keeps repeating, the same places attracting the same kind of attention across the same enormous stretches of time. And eventually, the speculation starts to look like something more than coincidence. After the Romans came, the Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon settlement of the London area is one of the more puzzling episodes in British urban history, because the Anglo-Saxons, largely abandoned Roman Londinium. The great basilica fell into ruin. The public baths were no longer maintained. The street grid of the Roman city, the neat rectangular pattern that had organized the urban space for 3.5 centuries, was largely ignored by the new settlers. Instead, the Anglo-Saxon settlement coalesced around a site about a mile to the west of Roman Londinium, in an area along the Strand, between the modern cities of London and Westminster, called Londonwick. This was a substantial trading town, a port town, and it was the economic and social centre of the region for several centuries. But it was outside the walls of the old Roman city. It was in the open fields beside the river, not in the ruins of the imperial capital. Why did the Anglo-Saxons avoid Roman Londinium? One answer is that a ruined city, even a great ruined city, is also a dangerous city. The buildings were collapsing. The sewers were blocked. The water supply had failed. The practical case for starting fresh somewhere else was compelling. But there is another element to the story, one that has to do with how the Anglo-Saxons understood the ruins around them. They called them the work of giants. They did not have a framework within which to understand how or why these massive stone structures had been built. Roman buildings were so far beyond the scale of anything that Anglo-Saxon technology and organization could produce that the inference was, for many of these people, that they had not been built by people at all, or not by people like themselves. They were the work of a race of giants, or of supernatural beings, or of a civilization so remote and so different from anything they knew that it might as well have been mythological. And places associated with supernatural beings, with giants, with the old powers, are places that carry ambivalence. They are powerful and therefore worth having access to. They are also dangerous and therefore worth approaching with caution. The religious life of Londonwich eventually reached back into the ruined city. The first St. Paul's Cathedral was built within the old Roman walls, on Ludgate Hill, in the late 7th century. The building of a Christian church there was not just a practical decision about where to put a cathedral. It was a statement about the relationship between the new faith and the old landscape, about the desire to sanctify and claim what had previously been pagan ground, to plant the cross in the ruins of the old world and declare that something new had begun. The pattern, again, the sacred place being recognized and reclaimed and reinterpreted by a new group of people who found it already charged with significance. And then the Vikings arrived, and the story got more complicated again. The Viking raids on Londonwich in the 9th century were devastating enough that Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, made the decision to reoccupy the old Roman city. Behind the old Roman walls, a resurrected London could be defended. So Londinium became London again, in the sense that the organized settlement moved back inside the Roman walls, which still partly stood, and the streets and the markets and the churches began to fill in the space that the ruins had occupied for 3 centuries. This is the London of the late Anglo-Saxon period, the London that the Normans conquered in 1066, the London from which the modern city grew. And beneath all of it, the earlier layers. Beneath the medieval city, the Saxon city. Beneath the Saxon city, the Roman city. Beneath the Roman city, the Iron Age settlement. Beneath the Iron Age settlement, the Bronze Age deposits, the Neolithic traces, the Mesolithic scatters, the Paleolithic tools. Beneath those, the bones of the animals that lived here before humans arrived, the glacial deposits, the river gravels, the geology of a landscape shaped over millions of years, and in between all of this, the things that do not fit neatly into any of these categories, the objects and features and discoveries that keep arriving in the hands of archaeologists and mudlarks and construction workers and tunnelers, announcing themselves from the darkness beneath the city and demanding to be incorporated into a story that already has enough complexity to be going on with. The Thames Tunnel, built by Mark Brunel and his son Isambard Kingdom. Brunel, in the 1820s and 1830s, was the first tunnel beneath a navigable river in the world. It was an engineering triumph of the first order, and it was also, during its construction, an involuntary archaeological project. The workers, cutting through the ground beneath the Thames, encountered deposits from multiple periods. They found Roman material. They found evidence of activities that they could not identify. They found the remains of a forest, a drowned forest of ancient trees, submerged beneath the Thames, at a depth that spoke of the period immediately after the last ice age, when the river was much lower and the landscape was still adjusting to the rising sea levels that followed the glacial retreat. Those drowned trees, their roots visible in the walls of the tunnel, their trunks identifiable as species, primarily oak and elm, were evidence of a landscape that has been underwater for 8,000 or 9,000 years, a landscape that was once walked by Mesolithic people who had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was going to be covered by the sea. The Thames Tunnel discovery was not unique. When the Victorians began building their great underground systems, the sewers first and then the railways, they were cutting through the history of London at every junction and every crossing and every deep shaft. The workers who built the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, in the 1860s encountered Roman roads, Roman buildings, Roman burials, Saxon graves, medieval wells, forgotten basements of burned-down buildings, plague pits from the Black Death, and a bewildering variety of objects that had been buried or lost or deliberately hidden over the course of 2,000 years of human activity in the same, relatively small area. Most of this was not systematically recorded. Most of it was simply scooped out with the clay and the gravel and dumped. Some of it was preserved, either formally, by officials of the Metropolitan Line who sent objects to the British Museum, or informally, by workers who pocketed interesting finds and took them home. The loss to the archaeological record is immense, but the incidental discoveries of the Victorian tunnellers and builders established, beyond any possible doubt, that London rests on a stratigraphy of extraordinary depth and complexity. Among the things that the Victorians found, and that continue to be found today during construction and maintenance work on London's underground infrastructure, are the remains of animals that simply should not be there. Elephants, for example. The Thames Valley in the interglacial periods was home to straight-tusked elephants, animals related to modern African elephants, but much larger, whose remains have been found at numerous sites in and around London. In 2020, during excavation work at a site near Canary Wharf, a tusk fragment was recovered from a depth that placed it securely in a warm interglacial period, roughly 115,000 years ago. The tusk was well preserved, the ivory still white enough to be recognizable as ivory, and it was accompanied by flint tools of the kind associated with Neanderthal populations. This particular elephant had apparently been butchered by Neanderthals at a site that is now beneath one of the most heavily developed areas of the modern city. Hippopotamuses have also been found in the London area. Hippopotamus bones recovered from the Thames. Valley gravels date to the same warm interglacial period, a time when the climate in Britain was warmer than it is today, and the fauna of the Thames Valley was genuinely exotic by modern British standards. Lions, hyenas, rhinoceroses. The list of animals whose remains have been found in the deposits beneath and around London reads like the inventory of a Pleistocene game park. And all of this was known by Neanderthal and earlier human populations who were living among these animals, hunting some of them, scavenging others, coexisting with predators that would have been genuinely dangerous. The London of 100,000 years ago was, in ecological terms, a completely different world. But it was a world in which humans were already present, already actively engaging with the landscape and its resources. The mammoth remains from the London area are less surprising than the hippopotamus bones, because mammoths are what most people think of when they think of Ice Age Britain. But the mammoth remains from London are interesting for reasons beyond their antiquity. At several sites, mammoth bones have been found in configurations that suggest deliberate human arrangement, rather than natural accumulation. Not just butchery, the cut marks that indicate a carcass being processed for meat, though there is plenty of that evidence too, but something more considered: arrangements of bones that do not result from normal carcass decomposition patterns, that seem to reflect human choices about how to position or organize or display the remains of an animal after its flesh had been removed. Similar arrangements have been found at other Paleolithic sites across Europe. They are interpreted, tentatively and with appropriate caution, as evidence of the kind of ritualized relationship with large game animals that is documented ethnographically in hunting societies from many parts of the world. The idea that even Paleolithic hunters, several 100,000 years ago, were doing something more than purely utilitarian processing of their prey, that they were engaging with the animal in some symbolic or ceremonial way, is one that makes many archaeologists deeply uncomfortable, because it pushes the origins of symbolic and ritual behavior far further back than the traditional narrative allows. But the evidence keeps pointing in that direction. And in London, with its extraordinary depth of human history, the evidence has been accumulating for long enough and in sufficient quantity that it is becoming harder and harder to explain away. There is also the question of what lies beneath the Thames itself. The riverbed is a buried landscape, a landscape of ancient topography overlaid by millennia of sedimentation. Some of the most significant prehistoric material from the London area has come not from the land, but from the river, not from excavations, but from the foreshore, and from the dredging operations that have been going on in the Thames for centuries. The foreshore is, in this sense, a window into the buried landscape, a place where erosion and tidal action continually expose material from lower levels, material that in many cases dates to periods that predate the existence of the river in its current form. The ancient land surface beneath the Thames, the surface that was exposed when the river was running lower and the sea level had not yet risen to its modern position, is one of the most archaeologically significant buried landscapes in Britain, and it is almost entirely inaccessible. It is underwater, it is under meters of sediment. It would require extraordinary resources to excavate, even in the most favourable conditions, and the conditions beneath the Thames are not favourable in any sense. What this buried landscape contains can only be inferred from the material that reaches the surface, and from occasional glimpses provided by construction work, dredging operations, and the rare moments when exceptionally low water levels expose portions of the riverbed that are normally always submerged. What the glimpses suggest is a landscape used by humans across a span of time extending back at least to the Paleolithic, and probably further. Tools and bones and other materials recovered from the Thames dredgings and the foreshore include objects from every period of prehistory represented in the London area. The distribution of these objects is not random. They cluster at certain points along the river, points that correspond to features of the submerged topography, to ancient fords and crossings and embayments, to the confluences of the Thames with its tributaries. The pattern reflects the use that prehistoric people made of the landscape, and that use was concentrated at the points of greatest value, the points of greatest accessibility, the points where the river offered the most to the people who lived beside it. In 2021, a remarkable discovery was made during low tide conditions at a site near the Thames foreshore at Vauxhall. A mudlark, working the foreshore with the specialist knowledge that experienced foreshore searchers accumulate over years, found a piece of worked bone that was clearly very old. The bone had been shaped not by any natural process, but by a human hand, using a stone tool. It was part of an animal's long bone, cut and shaped into what appeared to be a handle or a grip of some kind, and it bore a series of incised marks along its surface that looked deliberate rather than accidental. The object was reported to the appropriate authorities and eventually examined by specialists. The dating results, when they came back, placed the object in the Mesolithic period, somewhere around 7,000 years old, not a remarkable age in itself. There are plenty of Mesolithic objects known from the Thames, but the marks on the bone were unusual. They were regular. They were organized in a pattern that suggested they were not decorative in a random sense, but structured according to some principle. They might have been counting marks, they might have been symbolic marks of some kind, they might represent something else entirely, but they were intentional and they were complex, and they were old enough to raise the question of how elaborate the cognitive and symbolic life of the Mesolithic people of the Thames Valley actually was. This question, the question of the inner life of prehistoric people, is one of the most difficult and the most fascinating in the whole field of human prehistory. The material evidence of cognitive life, of symbolic behavior, of the ability to represent ideas in a material form is what we mean when we talk about the origins of art, of religion, of language, of all the things that we think of as making us distinctively human. And that evidence keeps being pushed further and further back in time, as each new discovery either extends the known range of some behavior or reveals a behavior where none was previously known to exist. The cave paintings of France and Spain, the most famous examples of Paleolithic art, date back around 40,000 years, and in some cases perhaps further. But the practice of making marks on objects, of imposing human intention on natural materials in ways that go beyond pure utility, has now been documented, going back hundreds of thousands of years, at sites in Africa and elsewhere. The famous ochre-engraved pieces from Blombos Cave in South Africa, with their geometric crosshatch patterns, date to around 75,000 years ago. The shell beads from the same site are even older, and the hand stencils from caves in Sulawesi in Indonesia, long thought to be younger, have been redated to at least 40,000 years, a date comparable to the earliest European cave art, demonstrating that the capacity for symbolic expression was not a European invention, but a feature of our species, wherever it went. In Britain, the evidence for early symbolic behavior is sparser, partly because of the nature of the materials and the preservation conditions, and partly because, as we have established, the population of Britain was not continuous. The people who occupied the Thames Valley 300,000 years ago were not the same as the people who occupied it 100,000 years ago, who were not the same as the people who occupied it 10,000 years ago. Each wave of occupation brought its own cultural practices, its own symbolic vocabulary, its own ways of engaging with the material world. But the accumulation of evidence suggests that even in the British Paleolithic, there was more going on cognitively and symbolically than the standard picture allows. At Swanscombe in Kent, a site just downstream from London, the skull fragments of an archaic human found in the 1930s and 1940s have been dated to around 400,000 years ago. This individual, sometimes called Swanscombe Man, though the skeletal characteristics suggest the skull may belong to a female, represents one of the oldest human remains from Britain. The site where the skull was found is rich in animal bones and Acheulean stone tools, and the assemblage as a whole tells a story of sustained human occupation of the Thames Valley during a warm interglacial period when the landscape was very different from today. The Swanscombe skull is in some ways more important than any individual discovery from the London area itself, because it establishes with great clarity how long the Thames Valley has been a place where human beings lived and died. 400,000 years, the number keeps coming back. 500,000 years of human presence in this landscape, concentrated along this river, returning again and again to this crossing, this threshold, this particular place where the geography creates something that has meant something to human beings for longer than we can comfortably imagine. One of the stranger episodes in the story of underground London involves the discovery, in the 1970s and 1980s, of a series of features in the area between Aldgate and Whitechapel that did not correspond to any known period of occupation and did not fit any recognized typology of archaeological feature. The features were large, cut deeply into the natural clay, and organized in a pattern that was suggestive of deliberate layout, but that did not match any Roman, medieval, or post-medieval site plan that the archaeologists involved had encountered. The material found within the features was confusing, a mixture of periods with objects from different centuries, jumbled together in ways that were consistent with deliberate backfilling rather than natural accumulation. Some of the objects were clearly very old, others were more recent. The chronological mixing made dating the features themselves extremely difficult. The site was not fully excavated. The constraints of the construction project that had exposed it made comprehensive investigation impossible. The archaeologists involved wrote up their findings, and the features were backfilled and built over. But the report, buried in the grey literature of London archaeology, the unpublished or minimally published reports that form the primary record of most of the excavations that take place in the city, contains a note of uncertainty that is unusual in its frankness. The authors could not explain what they had found. They could offer no confident interpretation. They could only record the features and their contents, and note that the features represented some kind of activity that was not within the scope of their knowledge to categorize. This kind of explicit uncertainty is rare in archaeological publications, which tend toward confident interpretation even when the evidence is thin. The fact that these authors felt the need to express it suggests that what they found was genuinely puzzling, not just uncertain, but outside the range of what they expected to encounter in a London excavation. The features remain unexplained. They may represent something quite mundane that was simply recorded in a way that made it look more mysterious than it was. Or they may represent something that we do not have a good interpretive framework for, something that falls outside the standard categories of London's archaeological history and that therefore has no obvious place in the story. Stories like this one accumulate in the grey literature of London archaeology. Individual excavations, each producing a site report, each adding a few pieces to a puzzle whose edges are not clearly defined and whose overall picture is not agreed upon. The total volume of this literature is enormous. Thousands of excavations have taken place in London over the past century, producing tens of thousands of pages of reports, analysis, and interpretation. Much of this literature is not publicly accessible. Some of it is held by the Museum of London, some by the various archaeological units that have worked in the city, some by developers and their consultants. Synthesizing it is a huge task, and it is a task that has been undertaken in various ways and with various results, but that has never been completed to anyone's full satisfaction, partly because the excavation continues, every construction project in the city potentially adding new material to a corpus that is already too large for any one person or team to hold in their head at once. What the grey literature, read in bulk, reveals is a London whose past is far more complex and far more deeply layered than the public account of the city's history generally suggests. The public account, the account you get in museums and history books and television documentaries, is a selective synthesis, a story that has been shaped by what is known and by what is considered significant and by the frameworks within which the people telling the story have been trained. It is not dishonest, not exactly, but it is necessarily incomplete. And the incompleteness tends to flatten the picture in particular directions, tends to emphasize the periods that are well understood and well documented, and tends to minimize or ignore the periods and the findings that do not fit neatly into the established account. One area where the established account is particularly thin is the question of what exactly was happening in the London area during the period between the end of the Roman occupation and the Norman conquest, a period of roughly 6 centuries during which the city went through transformations that are still not fully understood. The end of Roman rule in Britain is conventionally dated to 410 AD. the year in which the Emperor Honorius is said to have told the British cities to look to their own defence. But the reality is more complicated than that date suggests. Roman institutions in Britain did not collapse simultaneously and completely in 410. They eroded gradually, unevenly, at different rates in different places. In some areas, recognizably, Roman structures of administration and economy persisted for a generation or more after the official end of the Roman period. In others, the collapse was more sudden and more complete. In London, the evidence suggests that the urban population declined sharply in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, well before the formal end of Roman administration. The Great Basilica was being dismantled for its building materials by the late 4th century. The public baths were no longer in operation. The streets were becoming blocked with debris. The picture that emerges from the archaeology is one of a city that was losing its urban character before the political events of the early 5th century. A city whose population was falling away, whose economy was contracting, whose infrastructure was being cannibalized rather than maintained. Where did the people go? Some of them undoubtedly returned to the land, to agricultural settlements in the countryside around the city. Some of them may have gone back to the kinds of dispersed rural communities from which their ancestors had been drawn into the Roman urban economy. Some of them may have moved to other parts of Britain where conditions were better. The decline of Roman London was not simply a demographic event. It was a reorganization of the human geography of the region, a dispersal of the urban population back into the surrounding landscape, a reversal of the concentration that the Roman city had represented. And then, remarkably, people came back. They always came back. The geography that had drawn population to this site over hundreds of thousands of years continued to work its effect. The river crossing was still there. The sheltered embayments were still there. The river itself was still there, still offering its resources, still connecting the inland to the sea. The Saxon town of Lundenwic grew up in the ruins' shadow, outside the walls of the old city, but still in the same landscape, still organized around the same geographical logic. And eventually, the old city itself was refilled and rebuilt and reclaimed. Beneath Lundenwic, beneath the area around the Strand and Covent Garden, where the Saxon trading town flourished, archaeologists have found layers that belong to earlier periods of occupation, that speak of a continuous or near-continuous use of this stretch of riverfront going back far beyond the Saxon period. The layers are not always easy to read. The Strand area has been intensively developed and redeveloped over many centuries, and the earlier deposits are frequently disturbed, truncated, mixed. But they are there. The traces of earlier use persist beneath the shopping streets and the theatres and the office buildings, waiting for the next excavation, the next construction project, the next accidental encounter with the deep past that is always there, always present, always underfoot. The most dramatic accidental encounter in recent London archaeological history was probably the discovery of the Crossrail archaeology, generated by the construction of the Elizabeth Line, the new east-west underground railway that runs across London and that required, for its construction, the boring of two large tunnels through the heart of the city at depths significantly greater than those reached by the existing underground network. The Crossrail project generated one of the largest archaeological programs ever undertaken in London, a systematic program of excavation and watching. Brief at sites across the route that produced finds ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. Among the most significant discoveries of the Crossrail archaeology were those at the Bedlam Burial Ground. This was a cemetery associated with Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the institution that gave rise to the word Bedlam, and it was in use from the late medieval period into the early 19th century. The Crossrail excavation recovered thousands of burials from this site, a collection of human remains that has provided extraordinary insights into life and death in post-medieval London. The analysis of this collection has been ongoing, and it continues to produce findings that add complexity and nuance to our understanding of the social history of the city. But the Bedlam burials were not the only significant finds from the Crossrail program. At sites across the route, archaeologists encountered evidence of activity from multiple periods, from the prehistoric to the post-medieval, and the accumulated record of these discoveries has added substantially to what is known about the buried landscape of London. At one site on the eastern section of the Crossrail route, in the area of Whitechapel, the excavation encountered a series of features that were interpreted as part of a Roman road or track, but that also contained deposits of Bronze Age material at a depth significantly below the Roman features. The Bronze Age material included pottery and animal bone, and, most intriguingly, a fragment of worked bronze that appeared to be part of a vessel rather than a weapon or a tool. Bronze vessels from the Bronze Age are extremely rare finds in Britain. They indicate access to the technological and economic resources that could produce objects of considerable complexity and value, and their presence in this area at this date adds to the picture of the Bronze Age Thames Valley as a place that was connected to the wider world of European trade and exchange. Below the Bronze Age material, the excavation reached layers of natural clay and gravel that contained no archaeological material of any significance. This is the normal stratigraphic situation in London. Human activity above, geology below, the boundary between them marked by the transition from anthropogenic to natural deposits. But the thickness of the human activity layers, the depth of the archaeological sequence at this site, was remarkable. More than 3 meters of human occupation deposits representing activities spanning from the Bronze Age to the 19th century, compressed into a stratigraphy that a skilled archaeologist can read like a book. If the book is very complicated and some of the pages are missing and others are in the wrong order, that compression of human time into a vertical geological section is one of the things that makes urban archaeology so distinctive and so challenging. In rural areas, the archaeologist often encounters only 1 or 2 periods of significant activity at a given site. In London, at a typical site, you encounter everything, because London has been the destination, the centre, the inevitable endpoint of activity in this region, for so long that almost every period of human history in Britain left its mark here. The challenge is not finding evidence of the past. The challenge is making sense of it, fitting the fragments into a coherent story, understanding the relationships between the layers and between the objects they contain. And some of those objects resist understanding, not because they are damaged or poorly preserved, but because they are genuinely anomalous, genuinely outside the categories that the available frameworks provide for. The Roman London sculpture collections, particularly the pieces held by the Museum of London, include a number of objects that do not have obvious parallels in the mainstream Roman artistic tradition. Objects with iconographic programs that do not correspond to the standard Roman pantheon, that seem to combine elements from different traditions in ways that suggest the involvement of populations whose religious life was not straightforwardly Roman, but was shaped by pre-existing local beliefs that had been partially incorporated into the Roman cultural framework. This kind of cultural synthesis is well documented in Roman provincial archaeology generally. The Romans were tolerant of local deities and local practices, as long as they did not conflict with the basic requirements of Roman civic life. They allowed subject peoples to continue their religious traditions, and they often absorbed local deities into the Roman pantheon, either identifying them with Roman gods of similar function or simply allowing them to coexist with Roman worship. But the specific form that this synthesis took in London, the particular combination of Roman and pre-Roman elements that appears in the religious life of Londinium, reflects the specific pre-existing religious landscape of the region, a landscape about which we know relatively little, but which can be partially reconstructed from the material evidence. The genius loci, The spirit of the place was a concept that the Romans took very seriously. Every significant place had its own spirit, its own divine character that had to be acknowledged and propitiated. For the Romans building their new city at London, the spirit of the place was already there, already established, already recognized by the people who lived in this landscape. Before the Romans arrived, the Romans did not import their own set of divine forces from scratch. They engaged with what was already present, adding their own interpretations and their own ritual frameworks to a spiritual landscape that had been in existence, in some form, for far longer than Rome itself. The temples and shrines and sacred places of Roman London were in many cases built on ground that was already understood to be sacred, already recognized as the dwelling place of powers that demanded acknowledgement. The Romans gave those powers Roman names and Roman forms, but the powers themselves, the sense of this place as special, as charged, as significant in ways that went beyond mere utility, that was older than Rome, that was as old as the human occupation of the Thames Valley. There is something called the palimpsest effect in archaeology. A palimpsest is a manuscript from which the original writing has been partially erased and written over, so that traces of the earlier text remain visible beneath the later one. The term is used in archaeology to describe a landscape or a site where successive periods of use have partially obscured, but not entirely erased, the evidence of earlier activities. London is the ultimate urban palimpsest. Layer upon layer upon layer of human activity, each partially obscuring what came before, each being partially obscured by what came after. And the reading of this palimpsest, the recovery of the earlier texts from beneath the later ones, is the central challenge and the central achievement of London's archaeologists. What those archaeologists have recovered, piece by piece over many decades, is a picture of a place that has been central to human experience in this corner of the world for 500,000 years. Not always in the same way, not always with the same kind or the same degree of activity, but always recognized, always returned to, always found significant by whoever was here to find it. The Romans built a city on this site because it was already a node in the network of human activity. The Saxons rebuilt the city, or rather built a new city nearby, because the node was still there, still pulling people in. The Normans expanded and formalized what the Saxons had created. The medieval city grew on top of all of it, and the modern city grew on top of the medieval city, and the questions that the modern city keeps throwing up, the questions that each new excavation and each new accidental discovery keeps pushing into view, are questions about the nature of that persistence. Why does this place keep being important? The geographical answer, the river crossing, the sheltered embayments, the access to the sea, explains a great deal. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain the sacred geography, the recurrent sanctification of the same places across thousands of years by groups of people with no obvious cultural continuity. It does not explain the extraordinary concentration of votive deposits in the river at this specific stretch of the Thames. It does not explain the persistence of certain topographical features, certain hills and valleys, and springs and confluences, as foci of human attention across the entire span of the archaeological record. These are the questions that make London's past not just interesting, but genuinely mysterious. Not mysterious in the sense of deliberately concealed or suppressed, though there are certainly aspects of the archaeological record that have not received the public attention they deserve. Mysterious in the sense of not yet understood, not yet fully explained, still open to investigation and interpretation and the accumulation of new evidence. The finding beneath London that has perhaps generated the most sustained controversy and the most uncomfortable questions for the established account of the city's past is the evidence for a pre-Roman bridge. Not the bridge that the Romans built, which is well documented and whose location, at roughly the site of the modern London Bridge, is not disputed. A bridge, or something performing the function of a bridge, that predates the Roman invasion. The evidence for this structure is indirect. A pattern of Bronze Age and Iron Age votive deposits in the river that is concentrated in a very specific area, an area that corresponds almost exactly to the natural ford that would have made a crossing possible at this point, and that also corresponds to the area where the density of Bronze Age metalwork in the Thames is at its highest. The simplest explanation for this pattern is that the crossing was already being used and already being marked ritually, with objects thrown into the river before the Romans arrived. And the simplest explanation for the ritual marking of a crossing is that the crossing had a physical structure of some kind that made it recognizable as a place of importance, a threshold that demanded acknowledgement. A pre-Roman bridge or causeway across the Thames at London would not be unprecedented. There is good evidence for a late Bronze Age causeway at Vauxhall, a short distance upstream from the main river crossing, where a series of substantial timber posts driven into the riverbed have been dated to around 1500 BC. The Vauxhall Bronze Age structure is one of the oldest engineered structures associated with the Thames, and its existence demonstrates that the people of the Bronze Age Thames Valley were capable of organizing the construction of substantial river structures. A comparable structure further downstream, at the main river crossing, is not inherently implausible, but the evidence for it is indirect, and the implications of its existence would be significant. A Bronze Age bridge at London would mean that the site was already a major infrastructure node more than 1,000 years before the Romans arrived. It would mean that the decision to establish Londinium at this particular site was not a Roman invention, but a recognition of something that was already there, something that the pre-existing inhabitants of the landscape had already identified and developed and maintained. This question, the question of how much of Roman London was built on pre-existing foundations, both literal and metaphorical, is one of the most important open questions in London archaeology. And it connects to the broader question of how much we do not know about the deep past of this place, how much is still down there waiting to be found, how many objects and structures and patterns of activity remain in the ground beneath the streets and the buildings and the railway tunnels, waiting for the next excavation, the next accidental encounter, the next moment when the city reaches down into its own past and pulls something out that does not fit the story it has been telling about itself. The story that London tells about itself is a very particular story. It is a story of Roman origins, of Anglo-Saxon reinvention, of Norman conquest, of medieval growth, of great fires and great plagues, and great rebuildings, of empire and trade, and the slow accumulation of wealth and power that made this city the center of the largest empire in history. It is not a false story. Everything in it happened, but it is a story that begins, in the popular imagination, with the Romans. Everything before the Romans is preface, prologue, a necessary but essentially formless precondition for the real story that begins in 43 AD. And that beginning point is wrong. It is not wrong in a trivial sense. It is wrong in a way that distorts everything that comes after it, that makes it impossible to understand why London is where it is and what it has meant to the people who have lived here across the full span of human time. To understand London fully, you have to go deeper. You have to go all the way down to the Paleolithic hand axes in the Thames gravels, to the Neanderthal tools and the straight-tusked elephant bones, to the earliest human presence in this landscape. You have to understand that the river, which seems so permanent, so fixed, is actually an ancient and mutable feature of the landscape that has been moving and shifting and changing its course and its character across geological time. You have to understand that the landscape of the Ice Ages, the landscape in which the first humans to occupy this area were living, was so different from the modern landscape that it is almost unrecognizable as the same place. And yet it is the same place. The geography that drew humans here in the interglacial periods is the same geography that drew them here in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Roman period. The details changed. The climate changed. The fauna changed. The sea level changed. The course of the river changed. But the fundamental logic of the place, the reason why humans kept coming back to this particular bend in this particular river, that has remained consistent across 500,000 years. There is a philosophical concept called deep time, borrowed from geology and the work of thinkers like James Hutton and Charles Lyell, who in the 18th and 19th centuries established that the age of the Earth was vastly greater than anyone had previously imagined. Deep time is the temporal equivalent of deep space, a scale so vast that ordinary human experience cannot comfortably accommodate it, a scale that makes the entire span of recorded history look like a rounding error. The archaeological record of London is a reminder that human time, too, has a deep dimension that is very different from the shallow dimension that history, with its written records and its clearly dated events, tends to focus on. 500,000 years of human presence in the Thames Valley. That is deep time by any measure. And it is there, in the ground, beneath the city, waiting to be read by anyone who looks at the evidence with open enough eyes. The things that scientists keep finding beneath London are not just objects. They are not just curiosities to be displayed in museums and debated at academic conferences. They are evidence of a duration of human engagement with this place that fundamentally changes what we think London is. London is not a Roman city that grew to become a medieval city, that grew to become a modern city. London is a place that has been human for 500,000 years, that has been continuously or near continuously significant to the people who lived in and around it across that entire span, and that carries in the ground beneath its streets the accumulated record of all those people, all those activities, all those moments of life and death and ritual and exchange and violence and ceremony that have taken place here since the first archaic humans looked at the Thames and found it good. That record is fragmentary. It is incomplete. It is partial and puzzling and resistant to easy interpretation. But it is there. And every time someone cuts through the ground of this city, whether to build a new railway or a new office block or to mend a broken water main, they are potentially encountering some fragment of that record, some piece of the deep history that the city sits on top of without fully acknowledging. There is a man who has been walking the Thames foreshore for 30 years. He goes out on low tides, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more often. He carries a small trowel and a plastic bag and a reference book, and he walks slowly along the exposed strip of mud and gravel, looking for things. He has found Roman coins by the hundred. He has found medieval pottery in quantities sufficient to fill a room. He has found Tudor clay pipes, Victorian buttons, Georgian buckles, pieces of jet jewellery from the Bronze Age, an Anglo-Saxon strap-end, a medieval pilgrim badge from Canterbury, a Neolithic flint scraper. He has found things he cannot identify, objects whose period and purpose he cannot determine even after consulting with experts. He has found things that seem to belong together but were separated by centuries of river activity before the foreshore brought them into accidental proximity. He walks the same stretch of foreshore every time because it is the stretch he knows, the stretch where his 30 years of experience tell him what the patterns mean, where the concentration of older material tends to appear, where the tidal patterns create the conditions most likely to expose material from the deeper layers. He does not think about what he does as an act of archaeology, exactly. He thinks about it as a conversation. He is listening to what the river has to say, what the ground has to say, and most of what the ground says is things he already knows, things that fit the patterns he has learned over 30 years. But occasionally, the ground says something new. Occasionally, It produces something that does not fit the pattern, something that opens a question rather than answering one. And when that happens, he stands there in the mud, with the Thames running past his boots and the Tate Modern visible across the water, and he feels, he has said, as though the city is shifting beneath him, as though all the layers are becoming momentarily transparent, as though he could see through them to the beginning. That feeling, the feeling of the ground opening to reveal depth upon depth upon depth of human time, is what the Archaeology of London offers to anyone who pays close enough attention. It is a feeling that is very different from the standard tourist experience of the city, the experience of the Roman walls and the tower and the medieval churches and the great museums. Those things are real and they are important and they are worth visiting and knowing. But they are the surface. They are the most recent chapters of a story that began long before any of them were built. A story that is still being written in the ground beneath the city every time an excavation reaches a new level, every time the foreshore gives up a new find, every time the darkness beneath London yields something that the light above has not yet learned to explain. The scientists who work in this darkness, the archaeologists and geologists and environmental scientists and osteoarchaeologists and numismatists and ceramicists and all the other specialists whose expertise is required to read the record that the ground contains. They are doing something that goes beyond professional practice, beyond the accumulation of knowledge for its own sake. They are mediating between the deep past and the living present, translating the mute testimony of objects and bones and features and deposits into language that people can hear and respond to. They are making audible what the ground has been saying all along, what it has been trying to say to everyone who walks across it without stopping to listen. And what it is saying, what the accumulated evidence of 500,000 years of human presence in this landscape is saying, is something very simple and very profound. We were here, all of us were here, before the buildings and before the roads and before the bridges and before the city. We were here. We crossed this river and threw things into it and built things beside it and buried our dead under it and came back to it again and again across spans of time that dwarf anything the recorded history of this city contains. We were here and we mattered, and what we did here mattered, even though the city that was built on top of us does not fully acknowledge us, and the story that the city tells about itself does not begin at the place where we began. The things that scientists keep finding beneath London are telling us to rewrite that story, not to discard what we know, not to replace the rich and complex account of the last 2,000 years of London's history with some alternative narrative, but to extend it, to push it back, to make it begin at the beginning or as close to the beginning as the evidence allows, to acknowledge that the city above the ground is resting on a foundation of human experience that goes back much further than the Romans, much further than the Neolithic farmers, much further than any period that the word history normally encompasses. 500,000 years, that is how long humans have been coming to this place. That is how long the river has been drawing them in, how long the geography has been working its consistent and irresistible logic on the human populations of this corner of the world. And what they found here, what all of them found here across all of those millennia, was apparently something worth finding, something worth staying for, something worth coming back to, generation after generation, even as the world above changed around them beyond recognition. The darkness beneath London is full of voices. They are the voices of everyone who was ever here, who lived and died and worked and worshipped and fought and loved in this particular landscape over this astonishing span of time. The archaeologists are listening, the ground is speaking, and the story that is emerging from the conversation between them is stranger and deeper and more extraordinary than anything the standard account of London's past has ever suggested. This is the real history of London, not 2,000 years, 500,000, and the revision is only just beginning. We have barely scratched the surface. We have barely scratched the surface of what is down there, below the basement car parks and the utility tunnels and the Victorian sewers and the Roman roads and the Bronze Age deposits and the Mesolithic scatters, all the way down to the interglacial gravels and the bones of the animals that shared this valley with the earliest humans who ever looked at the Thames and recognized it as home. The scientists will keep digging. The foreshore walkers will keep watching the tides. The construction workers will keep calling in the archaeologists when they find something they cannot explain. And the ground will keep giving up its secrets, piece by piece, object by object, layer by layer, adding to the picture of a place that has been human for longer than any of us can easily comprehend. And every time something comes up from down there, every time the darkness yields something that the daylight has never seen before, the story has to be rewritten. Not because the previous version was false, but because the truth is always larger than the story we have been telling so far. Always more complicated, always more ancient, always more deeply entangled with the full length and depth of human time than the comfortable version of history allows. This is what lies beneath London. This is what scientists keep finding. This is why the rewriting will never be complete. Because the ground goes on, the layers go on, the depth of human time in this place goes on, and the darkness beneath the city holds more than we have yet had the tools or the time or perhaps the courage to fully understand. But we are trying, and the trying itself is a part of the story. One more layer added to the palimpsest, one more conversation between the present and the deep past. One more attempt to hear what the ground has been saying all along in the language of stone and bone and river-washed bronze, in the language of 500,000 years of human life beside a river that was old, before any of us were born, and will be old long after all of us are gone. That river is still running. The tide is still turning. The foreshore is still exposed at low water, still offering its gifts to those who walk slowly enough and look carefully enough to see them. And in the darkness beneath the streets, the layers are still there, still compressed, still patient, still waiting with the extraordinary equanimity of the very ancient to be found. The city above may not know what it is resting on, but the ground knows. The ground has always known, and it is telling us, with every object that surfaces from its depths, every timber that emerges from the river mud, every skull that appears in the spoil from a construction trench, every hand axe that a foreshore walker lifts from the gravel and holds up to the winter light. We were here, all of us. We were all here, in this place, beside this river, doing what humans do, for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. And we are still here. We never really left. Think about the streets of the City of London on a Tuesday morning in November. The grey light coming down between the buildings. The suited figures moving with purpose through the narrow lanes, past the coffee houses and the sandwich shops and the glass towers that reflect nothing clearly. These are people who know exactly where they are going. They are not people who look at the ground. They are not people who look up, particularly. They are moving through a landscape they understand completely, a landscape whose logic and whose purposes are entirely familiar to them. They do not know that they are walking over the dead. They do not know that the ground beneath their feet contains, at various depths, the compressed evidence of activities ranging from hand axe manufacture to medieval plague burial to Iron Age ritual deposition, all layered in the geology beneath the pavements like the pages of a book that nobody is reading. This is not their fault. The city above the ground is designed to demand attention. It is loud, and it is bright, and it is insistent, and it does not encourage the kind of reflective looking down that would allow you to notice what the pavement is actually resting on. The pavement is just the pavement. The street is just the street. The buildings are just the buildings. The city is what it appears to be, a present tense reality, a functional modern metropolis that serves the needs of the people moving through it and does not require them to engage with anything that lies outside of that function. But there are people who see it differently. There are people who walk the streets of the City of London and see not the buildings that are there, but the buildings that were there before, the buildings beneath the buildings, the accumulation of construction and demolition and reconstruction that has been going on continuously for 2,000 years on this small patch of ground. They are archaeologists, some of them, but not all of them. Some of them are simply people who have looked at this place long enough to understand that it has depth in both the physical and the metaphorical sense, that it extends not just upward into the towers of glass and steel, but downward into the earth, into a past that is right there beneath their feet at every moment. One of those people is a woman who has spent 20 years working as an archaeologist in the City of London, on the team associated with the Museum of London Archaeology that handles the watching briefs and excavations mandated by the planning process whenever anyone wants to build or demolish or dig in the historic core. She has, over those 20 years, looked at more cross-sections of London's past than almost anyone alive. She has seen the stratigraphy of the city from the inside, from within the excavation trenches, from the perspective of someone standing at the bottom, looking up at the walls of soil and rubble and compacted archaeology that define the space she is working in. And she has described, in an interview that was published in a small journal devoted to London archaeology, the feeling that the work gives her of being inside the city's body, inside its physical structure, in a way that nobody who only knows London from the surface can ever fully appreciate. She talks about the smell of it. Old London smells different from the surface. Not bad exactly, though it can be that, too, but different. The clay has a smell. The Roman deposits have a characteristic smell, something about the organic content of the layers, the centuries of domestic occupation, the accumulated material of daily life compressed into the geology. The deeper you go, the older the smell, until at the level of the natural deposits, you reach something that has no human component at all. Just geology, just earth, just the pre-human landscape doing its impersonal geological work. She talks about the light. You work in the trench with artificial lighting, in most cases, because you are below the level where natural light reaches. The walls of the trench are your entire visual world for the hours you are working. You read them, you identify the layers, the interfaces between one deposit and another, the features cut into the layers, the post holes and the pits and the walls and the floors that represent the physical actions of people in the past. You develop an intuition for what you are looking at, a feel for the archaeology that goes beyond what you can verbalize, a sense of when something is significant that you cannot always immediately explain. She talks about finding the unexpected. In 20 years of excavating in the City of London, she has found many things that she did not expect to find, things that were outside the range of what the existing knowledge suggested should be there at that depth, at that location, in that context. Not all of these unexpected finds have been dramatic. Many of them have been small additions to the existing picture, small corrections or complications of the known story. But some of them have been genuinely surprising, genuinely outside the framework, genuinely demanding of a reconsideration of what was assumed to be known. She will not talk about specifics, not on the record, not in a way that could be quoted or attributed. This is not because she is being evasive. It is because the publication process for archaeological findings in London is slow and complicated, and because the information she holds is in many cases embargoed until the relevant reports have been produced and peer-reviewed, and because the world of London archaeology is small enough that being the person who leaked something important before it was officially published would be professionally damaging in ways that she cannot afford. But she will say, carefully, that there are things in the ground beneath the City of London that have not yet been made public, and that will, when they are made public, require a reconsideration of certain aspects of the received account of this place's history. She is not the only person who says things like that. Other archaeologists working in London, in conversations that are necessarily somewhat guarded because of the same professional constraints, speak in similar terms. There is a sense, among the people who know the London archaeological record most intimately, that the public understanding of this city's past is significantly behind what the evidence actually shows, and that the gap between the two is larger than it has ever been before because the rate of discovery has accelerated substantially in recent decades due to the increase in required archaeological assessment before construction projects are permitted. Before the 1990 Planning Policy Guidance. Note 16, which for the first time required developers in England and Wales to take account of archaeological considerations in their planning applications. The archaeology of construction in London was largely uncontrolled. Buildings were built and demolished without systematic archaeological investigation of what lay beneath them. What was found incidentally, by chance, without context, without the documentation that gives archaeological material its meaning. The losses to the record were enormous. But since PPG 16 and its successor documents, the requirement for archaeological assessment has meant that a much higher proportion of development sites in London are now subject to professional investigation before and during construction. The result has been a substantial increase in the volume and quality of the archaeological record, and a corresponding acceleration in the accumulation of findings that complicate and challenge the existing account of London's past. The problem is that the publication of those findings has not kept pace with their accumulation. Archaeological fieldwork produces reports. Some of those reports are published in peer-reviewed journals or in volumes produced by archaeological units or by the Museum of London. Many more are produced as planning documents, submitted to the local planning authority as a record of the investigations conducted in fulfillment of the planning requirements, and then filed. These filed reports, the grey literature of London archaeology, are technically public documents, accessible to anyone who knows how to find them and is willing to navigate the systems through which they can be accessed. But they are not widely read. They are not reviewed in newspapers. They are not discussed in general interest magazines. They are produced by specialists for specialists in a format and language that assumes a high degree of prior knowledge, and they reach almost no one outside the professional community. This gap between what is known professionally and what is known publicly is a structural feature of British archaeology, not specific to London. But in London, it has particular consequences, because London's past is a subject of enormous public interest, because millions of people care about this city's history and want to understand it, and because the professional record of what lies beneath the city is so much richer and stranger and more deeply layered than the public account suggests. The public account of London's past is shaped by what is displayed in museums and what is taught in schools and what is discussed in popular media. The Museum of London, which is currently in the process of moving to a spectacular new home at Smithfield Market, is one of the best urban archaeology museums in the world. Its collections are extraordinary and its exhibitions are of high quality. But even it cannot display everything. Even it has to select, to prioritize, to choose which stories to tell and which to leave untold. And the selection process, inevitably, tends to favor the periods and the objects that are best known and best documented, the periods where the framework is most established and the objects most recognizable. Roman London, medieval London, the Great Fire, the Victorian City. These are the chapters of the museum's story, because these are the chapters of the standard narrative, and the standard narrative shapes what the museum's visitors expect to encounter. What would it look like to tell the full story from the beginning? What would a museum of London's deep past look like? A museum that started not with the Romans, but with the Acheulean hand axes from the Thames gravels, with the Neanderthal tools from Purfleet and Crayford and Swanscombe, with the straight, tusked elephant and the hippopotamus, and the woolly rhinoceros that shared the Thames Valley with the earliest humans to live here. What would it feel like to walk through such an exhibition? To be confronted at the outset, not with familiar Roman busts and medieval armour, but with the deep time of the Thames Valley, with the geological and biological record of a landscape shaped over millions of years that includes, for a tiny fraction of that time, the traces of our own species. The answer is that it would feel vertiginous. It would feel like standing at the edge of a very deep well and looking down. It would make the received story of London, the story that begins with the Romans, feel not false, but narrow, like a spotlight illuminating one small area, while the darkness beyond it extends in every direction. And that feeling, that sense of the inadequacy of the familiar story in relation to the full depth of what is actually there, is a productive feeling. It is a feeling that opens questions rather than closing them. It is the feeling that proper engagement with the deep past always generates. We are not good at deep time. As a species, we are very good at the time scales of individual lives and of human generations. We understand centuries, roughly. We can grasp millennia with some effort. But hundreds of thousands of years, let alone millions, are genuinely beyond the grasp of direct intuition. We can say the numbers, 500,000 years, 400,000 years. But what those numbers mean, what it would actually feel like to live through that span of time, to be the accumulation of all the individual lives and individual moments that those numbers contain, is beyond our imaginative capacity in any direct sense. This limitation affects how we engage with the deep past, not just of London, but of any place. We default to the period that written records illuminate, because written records are legible to us in a way that stone tools and buried deposits are not. The Roman period feels more accessible than the Bronze Age, even though the Bronze Age was vastly longer and contained an enormous richness of human experience. The medieval period feels more accessible than the Neolithic, even though the Neolithic gave this landscape some of its most fundamental structures. We gravitate toward the legible, toward the written, toward the period that has left records we can read, and personalities we can name, and events we can date. And in doing so, we systematically undervalue the long prehistory of the places we live in, the deep human time that stretches beneath the written record into a past that is less legible, but no less real. The archaeologists working in London are trying to make that past legible. They are translating the non-verbal record of the ground into language, into accounts that people can read and understand and use to revise their picture of the city they live in. It is slow work. It is painstaking work. It is work that often produces small results that require patient accumulation before their significance becomes clear. But it is work that is gradually, incrementally, pushing the public understanding of London's past in the direction of the truth. A truth that is considerably stranger and considerably older than the conventional story of the city allows. And occasionally, it produces a discovery that is not small. Occasionally, the ground offers something so unexpected, so clearly significant, so impossible to fit into the existing framework without substantially revising that framework, that it demands immediate attention and generates exactly the kind of public interest that most archaeological findings do not. The discovery of the Crossrail mammoth, a fragment of mammoth tusk found during the construction of Crossrail at a depth of about 8 meters in the area of Liverpool Street Station, was one of those moments. The discovery was made in 2013, early in the Crossrail archaeological program, and it attracted substantial media attention. The tusk fragment was enormous, considerably larger than any mammoth material previously found within the area of Greater London, and it was preserved well enough to allow detailed analysis. The analysis confirmed that it was genuine Pleistocene material, genuinely ancient. genuinely from an animal that had walked through what is now one of the busiest railway hubs in the world a very long time ago. The tusk was eventually dated to approximately 120,000 years ago, placing it firmly within the last interglacial period. The discovery was covered in newspapers and websites across Britain and beyond. People were fascinated by it, by the sheer improbability of an enormous mammoth tusk appearing from beneath one of the most intensely urban environments on Earth. And the fascination was legitimate, because the discovery was genuinely remarkable, because the tusk was genuinely spectacular, and because the image of a mammoth walking through what is now the financial heart of London was genuinely arresting. But the coverage, for the most part, treated the discovery as a curiosity, an interesting aside, a surprise finding that added a colourful chapter to the history of the city without substantially changing anything about how that history was understood. This is the standard treatment of discoveries from the deep past of London. They are interesting, they are surprising, they are occasionally spectacular, and then they are filed away, put in storage, or on display, and the standard account of the city's history continues more or less unchanged, because the standard account does not have a framework within which to incorporate what the deep past reveals. The standard account begins with the Romans. The mammoth tusk is from before the Romans. Therefore, fascinating as it is, it belongs to a different story, a natural history story rather than a human history story, and does not substantially affect the picture of how and when and by whom the city was founded. But this separation, this insistence on keeping natural history and human history in different boxes, is itself part of the problem. The mammoth tusk is not from before the human history of London. It is from within the human history of London, because humans were present in the Thames Valley at the time that mammoth was walking through it. The mammoth and the humans were contemporaries. They shared the same landscape. The humans may have hunted this particular mammoth. They may have scavenged its carcass. They certainly knew that mammoths existed and certain things about mammoth behavior, because knowing things about the large animals in your environment is fundamental to survival as a hunter-gatherer. The mammoth tusk is not an artifact, strictly speaking, but its presence in the London deposits is connected to the human history of this place in ways that the standard framework of natural history versus human history does not allow us to appreciate. This is a broader problem with how we understand the relationship between human beings and the non-human world in the deep past. We tend to see human history as something that begins where natural history ends, as though the emergence of human consciousness and human culture represents a break from nature, a departure from the biological and geological processes that shaped the world before our ancestors arrived. But this is not how it worked. Our ancestors, for most of the duration of human existence on this planet, were embedded in the non-human world in ways that we are not. They were part of the ecosystem, not standing outside it. They were affected by the same climatic and environmental forces that affected the mammoths and the straight-tusked elephants and the hippopotamuses. When the ice advanced, it affected all of them, human and non-human alike. When the ice retreated, it created opportunities for all of them, human and non-human alike. The history of human presence in the Thames Valley is inseparable from the natural history of the Thames Valley, because for most of that history, human beings were part of the natural world rather than masters of it. Understanding this does not diminish the significance of human history. It enriches it by placing it in a context that reveals how much human survival has always depended on the capacity to adapt to and to work within the non-human world. The people who lived in the Thames Valley during the warm interglacial periods were not just surviving. They were doing something more sophisticated than mere survival. They were managing complex relationships with the animals they depended on, with the plants they ate, with the rivers and the weather and the landscape features that defined their world. They were accumulating knowledge across generations, preserving it in ways that did not leave written records, but that are gradually becoming legible through archaeological investigation. And they were doing all of this in a landscape that is, in its deep structure, the same landscape that is now London. The Thames is the constant. The Thames has been flowing through this landscape, in one form or another, for far longer than human beings have existed. In the Miocene epoch, millions of years before the first humans appeared anywhere on Earth, the Proto-Thames was flowing through what is now the central part of modern Britain, in a direction and in a context that would be unrecognizable from the river's modern character. The great glaciations of the Pleistocene rerouted the Thames repeatedly, pushing it southward from its original course through what is now the Vale of St. Albans, establishing the channel it now occupies in more or less its modern position. The river that the first humans encountered when they moved into Britain during the warm interglacial periods was already ancient in geological terms, already deeply incised into the landscape, already creating the gravel terraces that now contain the archaeological record of those early human populations. This geological antiquity of the Thames is important because it means that the geographical features that made the Thames Valley attractive to human populations, the sheltered topography, the gravel terraces above the floodplain, the confluence of tributaries, the crossing point at the natural ford, were already established by the time the first humans arrived. The river and its landscape came first. The humans came because the landscape was inviting, and they kept coming back across hundreds of thousands of years because the landscape kept being inviting, because the geographical logic that made the Thames Valley a good place for human beings to live remained consistent even as the climate changed and the sea level rose and fell and the fauna changed and the plant communities changed and everything, except the fundamental topography of the landscape, changed around it. There is a concept in archaeology called persistence of place, the tendency of certain locations to maintain their significance to human communities across long periods of time, even when there is no direct cultural continuity between the successive groups that use them. The concept is relevant across much of the archaeological world, but it is particularly striking in the Thames Valley, where the same locations appear to have attracted human attention, been used for significant activities, or been recognized as important in some way, across spans of time that exceed anything that cultural transmission could maintain. The locations in question are not random. They are locations defined by specific geographical features, river confluences, crossing points, springs, prominent hills, sheltered embayments. These are features that have practical significance, that offer specific advantages to human populations, regardless of the period or the cultural context. The fact that they have been recognized and used by many different groups across many different periods is therefore not entirely mysterious. The geographical logic that made them valuable in the Mesolithic continued to make them valuable in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Roman period and beyond. But the practical logic does not explain everything. It does not explain the consistent association of certain locations with ritual activity, with the deliberate deposition of valuable objects, with practices that go beyond mere utility. The Thames foreshore at various points along the central London stretch has produced concentrations of votive material, objects that were clearly placed in the river as offerings, that span multiple periods. The same stretch of river was receiving offerings in the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman period, and possibly later. This is not simply the repetition of a practical activity at a location that offers practical advantages. This is the repetition of a ritual activity at a location that is recognized across different periods and different cultural contexts as having some quality that makes it appropriate for the kind of behavior that involves giving things to the water. What is that quality? How do you explain the persistent sanctity of a location across periods when there is no cultural continuity, when the people giving offerings to the Thames in the Iron Age did not inherit their practice directly from the people giving offerings to the Thames in the Bronze Age, but had arrived at the same understanding of this place through their own independent engagement with it. The most honest answer is that we do not fully know. We can describe the phenomenon. We can document it across multiple sites and multiple periods. We can observe that certain geographical features seem consistently to attract this kind of attention. But we cannot, with confidence, explain what it is about those features that generates the response. What quality it is that different groups of people in different periods have found in the same places. Some archaeologists would resist the question, arguing that the persistent use of the same locations for ritual activity is simply a function of geographical logic and tradition. That once a place has been recognized as significant, the tradition of treating it as significant persists even when the specific rationale for that significance has been forgotten or reinterpreted. This is a reasonable argument. It is consistent with what we know about how human cultural practices work. Traditions are conservative. They persist even when the original reasons for them have been lost. The tradition of treating certain stretches of the Thames as places where offerings should be deposited may have originated in a very specific context, in a very specific period, for reasons that made perfect sense to the people who originated it. As generations passed and cultural contexts changed, the specific reasons may have been forgotten or transformed into something unrecognizable. But the practice itself, the habit of treating this place as a place where things are given to the water, persisted. This is an intellectually satisfying explanation in some respects. But it raises a prior question. Why did the tradition originate at this particular place? What was it about this stretch of the Thames that prompted the first people who used it to decide that it was a place where things should be given to the water? Was it purely the crossing point, the threshold character of the ford, that generated the initial response? Or was there something else, something about the character of the place, the way the light hits the water at a particular time of day, the sound the river makes in certain conditions, the specific visual relationship between the river and the surrounding landscape, that generated a response in the people who first encountered it, that was interpreted in their cultural framework as an encounter with something sacred? We cannot answer this question. The people who first recognized this place as sacred left no account of their reasoning. They left only the material evidence of their practice, the objects thrown into the river, the structures built near it, the activities organized around it. The inner life of that recognition is lost, but the outer expression of it persists in the ground and in the river, available to be found and documented and thought about. The thinking that the material evidence demands is some of the most interesting and some of the most difficult thinking in British archaeology. It requires holding in mind, simultaneously, the practical and the symbolic, the environmental and the cultural, the specific and the general. It requires resisting the temptation to over-explain, to impose a coherent narrative on evidence that is inherently fragmentary and resistant to complete interpretation. And it requires maintaining openness to the possibility that the past was stranger and richer and more complex than the existing frameworks allow, that the people who lived in the Thames Valley, across the long span of human prehistory, were doing things and thinking things and feeling things that we cannot fully reconstruct, but that the material evidence keeps pointing toward. There is another kind of finding beneath London that deserves attention, a kind of finding that is not spectacular in the way that a mammoth tusk or a Bronze Age votive deposit is spectacular, but that is in some ways more significant because of what it implies about the organization and sophistication of the pre-Roman Thames Valley. That finding is evidence of long-distance exchange. Long-distance exchange, the movement of objects and materials over distances that exceed what could be covered in a day or a few days of travel is one of the clearest indicators of social complexity in the archaeological record. When an archaeologist finds an object made from a material that occurs naturally only at a great distance from where the object was found, they are finding evidence of a network of contacts, of relationships, of mutual obligations and exchanges that connected the community where the object was found to communities far away. The existence of such networks implies a degree of social organization, of trust and reciprocity, of communication and agreement that goes considerably beyond what we tend to imagine when we picture the lives of prehistoric communities. The Thames Valley, in the Neolithic period, was already participating in exchange networks that covered substantial distances. Axes made from igneous rock from sources in Cornwall, in Wales, in the Lake District, have been found at Neolithic sites in and around London. These axes were not made locally. The rock they are made from does not occur in the geology of the Thames Valley. They were either carried from their sources by their makers, or more likely, they moved through a series of exchanges, passing from hand to hand and from community to community along routes that connected different parts of Britain. The presence of these axes at Thames Valley sites tells us that the communities of the Neolithic Thames Valley were embedded in exchange networks that extended across much of Britain. Networks that were organized and maintained by the kinds of social relationships, the alliances and obligations and gift-giving ceremonies that are the lifeblood of pre-state societies. By the Bronze Age, the exchange networks had extended beyond Britain. Mediterranean objects in Bronze Age British contexts have already been mentioned, but the scale and complexity of the connections revealed by the archaeological record of this period are genuinely remarkable. The bronze itself, the metal that defined the period, was produced from an alloy of copper and tin. Copper sources exist in Britain, primarily in Wales and the West. Tin is rarer, concentrated mainly in Cornwall. To make bronze, communities in different parts of Britain had to be connected to each other. The tin from Cornwall moving to the copper sources, or the copper moving to the tin sources, and the combined materials, or the finished alloy, moving outward to wherever the bronze was needed. This was not a simple bilateral exchange. It was a complex network, sustained across generations, organized by whatever social mechanisms the Bronze Age communities of Britain had developed for managing relationships of mutual dependence. And then, coming into this network from outside, were the Mediterranean objects. The Phoenicians, or their predecessors, the trading cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, were already exploring the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of Europe before the end of the second millennium BC. They were interested in raw materials, in metals particularly, and the metals of Atlantic Europe. The tin of Cornwall and the copper of Wales and the gold of Ireland were exactly the kinds of materials they were looking for. The contact between the Mediterranean and Atlantic Europe in the late Bronze Age was not extensive by later standards. But it was real. It was documented in the archaeological record by the appearance of Mediterranean objects at Atlantic European sites and Atlantic European materials at Mediterranean sites. And the Thames Valley, with its river access to the interior of Britain and its position at the hinge between the southern and eastern shores of England, was one of the likely points of entry for material coming from the south, from the continental trading networks that connected Britain to the Mediterranean world. This is relevant to the question of what London was before the Romans arrived, because it suggests that the site of London was already, in the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, a node in networks that extended far beyond the immediate region. It was not just locally important, it was important in a wider context, connected to the trading and exchange systems of a much larger world. And when the Romans arrived and chose this site for their major urban development, they were not choosing it in isolation. They were choosing a site that was already recognized by the people who were already there as a place of significance in a wide network of connections. They were, in that sense, building on something that was already there. The recognition of this pre-existing significance is beginning to reshape the way archaeologists talk about the origins of London. The older account, in which Londinium was essentially a Roman creation imposed on a blank landscape, is giving way to a more nuanced account in which the Roman city was built on a site that was already functioning as a center of activity, already connected to the wider networks of exchange and communication that defined the economic and social life of late prehistoric Britain. The Roman contribution was to formalize and monumentalize what was already there, to add the physical infrastructure, the roads and the bridges and the public buildings and the harbour installations that transformed a pre-existing centre into a fully urban settlement of the Roman type. This revised account does not diminish the Roman achievement. Building Londinium was a genuinely remarkable exercise in urban creation. The engineering, the organisation, the investment of resources, the administrative framework, all of these were extraordinary. But it places the Roman achievement in a context that is more complex and more interesting than the older account allowed. The Romans were not starting from nothing. They were engaging with something that was already there, that was already structured and organized and significant, and they were transforming it into something new while building on the foundations that the pre-existing population had created. And beneath those foundations, the deeper past continues. The Iron Age below the Roman period, the Bronze Age below the Iron Age, the Neolithic below the Bronze Age, the Mesolithic below the Neolithic, the Paleolithic below the Mesolithic, layer upon layer of human time compressed into the geology of the city, waiting for the archaeologist's trowel, the construction worker's discovery, the mudlark's patient eye. In the winter of 2016, a particularly low tide on the Thames exposed a section of the foreshore at a site near Battersea that is normally submerged. A foreshore searcher working the exposed section found a concentration of Bronze Age material that included, among other things, a bronze cauldron fragment of considerable size. The fragment was corroded and encrusted with the deposits of centuries, but its form was recognizable. The rim of a large vessel, substantial enough to have held a considerable quantity of liquid or food. Bronze cauldrons are rare finds in British archaeology. They are associated with feasting, with the display of wealth and generosity that cemented social relationships in Bronze Age and Iron Age societies. The provision of food and drink at communal gatherings was a mechanism of social power. The person who could feed the group was the person who commanded the group's loyalty and attention. Cauldrons were the physical embodiment of that mechanism, the containers in which the feast was prepared and served. The fragment from the Battersea foreshore was eventually analysed and dated to the late Bronze Age, approximately 900 to 800 BC. It was not alone. The same area of foreshore, examined more carefully following the initial discovery, produced additional fragments of bronze metalwork, pieces of pottery, and a quantity of animal bone that appeared to represent the remains of consumption rather than mere refuse. The deposit as a whole was consistent with the kind of material that accumulates at the site of a major feast or gathering. The residue of communal eating and drinking, including the remains of the vessels used to prepare and serve the food, thrown into the river at the conclusion of the event. Who was feasting at this spot on the banks of the Thames 3,000 years ago? The answer is almost certainly that we will never know with any specificity. We cannot name them. We cannot place them within any known social hierarchy or political structure. We cannot tell their stories in the way that history tells the stories of named individuals. But we can infer something about them from the material they left behind. They were people of some means, or connected to people of some means, because bronze cauldrons were not cheap, and their possession indicated access to significant resources. They were organized because feasting at this scale requires planning and preparation. They were gathered at this spot on this river for a purpose that was both practical, because feasts serve the practical function of social bonding and the affirmation of mutual obligation, and ritual, because the location at the river's edge and the deposition of the feasting remains in the water suggests a ceremonial dimension to the gathering. They were, in other words, human beings doing what human beings do, organizing their social lives through shared activities, maintaining their relationships through the exchange of food and gifts, marking important moments with ceremony and the deliberate disposal of things in places that they regarded as significant. They were doing all of this at a site that is now within the boundaries of Greater London, on a riverbank that is now developed beyond recognition, at a moment in time that is 3,000 years in the past. And the only reason we know they were there at all is that the river kept what they left, and the tide exposed it again in the winter of 2016, and a person with the knowledge and the patience to recognize what they were looking at happened to be walking the foreshore on the right day at the right time. This is how the deep past of London is recovered, not through grand systematic excavations, though those contribute enormously to the record, but also through the patient, accumulated work of foreshore searchers and construction site archaeologists and chance observers, through the slow draining of the grey literature and the occasional eruption of a major discovery into public awareness, through the persistent collective effort of many people over many years to pay attention to what the ground is saying, to listen carefully to what the river keeps yielding, to take seriously the evidence of a human past in this place that extends back far beyond the period that history normally acknowledges. The sum of that effort is beginning to be legible, not as a complete story, because a complete story is not available and may never be, but as a picture of remarkable depth and complexity, of a place that has been important to human beings for 500,000 years, that has been recognized as significant, returned to, used and reused across the entire span of human presence in this corner of the world. A place whose modern incarnation as one of the largest and most complex cities on Earth is the latest chapter of a story that began before our species, as we now know it existed, before the Thames was running in its current channel, before the British Isles were islands. That story is still being written. Every excavation adds to it. Every foreshore find adds to it. Every analysis of ancient DNA from bones found in London soil adds to it, because the ancient DNA record of the city is beginning to reveal the genetic history of its populations in ways that complement and sometimes challenge what the material culture tells us. The picture is becoming richer, more complex, more resistant to simple summary, and more interesting for all of that complexity. The things that scientists keep finding beneath London are doing exactly what they should do. They are complicating the story. They are extending it. They are demanding that we think harder and more carefully about what this place is and what it has been and how long it has been anything at all. They are refusing to let the comfortable version of the city's history go unchallenged. They are insisting, from the ground up, from the deepest levels of the stratigraphy to the most recent layers of the archaeological record, that the full truth of this place is stranger and older and more extraordinary than any version of the story that has yet been told. That insistence is valuable. It is the insistence of the evidence itself, of the mute testimony of objects and bones and deposits and features that speak a language that the archaeologists are learning to read with increasing fluency. And what that language is saying, across all the periods and all the layers and all the individual discoveries that have accumulated over decades and centuries of investigation, is something worth listening to carefully. It is saying that this place is very old, older than we have acknowledged, older than the story we tell about it begins, and that the story we tell about it, as long and as rich as it already is only a fraction of the story that is actually there, waiting in the ground, waiting to be found, waiting to be told. We owe it to the people who were here before us, all of them, from the earliest humans who walked the banks of the Proto-Thames hundreds of thousands of years ago, to the Neolithic farmers and the Bronze Age metalworkers and the Iron Age communities and the Romans and the Saxons and the Normans and the medieval Londoners and the post-medieval Londoners, to tell the full story, or as much of it as the evidence allows, to extend the narrative back as far as it goes, to acknowledge the depth of the human presence in this place. And the depth is extraordinary. The ground beneath London contains 500,000 years of human time. 500,000 years of living and dying and working and worshipping and fighting and trading and loving in this particular place, beside this particular river. 500,000 years of people finding this place good, finding it worth staying in or coming back to, finding it significant in ways that have varied enormously across time, but that have been consistent in at least one respect. The consistency of the recognition itself, the consistent willingness of human beings of every period to find something in this landscape that makes it worth their attention. That consistency is the deepest mystery of London, not the specific discoveries, spectacular as some of them are, not the individual objects and features and deposits that the archaeologists keep pulling out of the ground, but the underlying pattern that all of those discoveries reveal, the pattern of a place that has been human for longer than we can comfortably imagine, and that shows no signs of having exhausted what it has to tell us. The rewriting is not finished, it has barely begun. The ground has more to say, it always does. And the people who are listening, who are paying attention, who are learning the language that the ground speaks, will keep translating what they hear into terms that the rest of us can understand. That is the work. That is the conversation. And the conversation has been going on, in one form or another, for as long as there have been human beings in this landscape to participate in it, which is a very long time indeed. In the year 1986, a worker on a construction site near Liverpool Street Station in the City of London found something lodged in the ancient clay at the bottom of a foundation trench. He was not an archaeologist. He was a labourer, a man who had been digging in London's earth for 20 years and who had found things before, coins and clay pipes and the occasional Roman potsherd, the kind of incidental discoveries that construction work in the City of London routinely produces. What he found on this particular morning was different. He could see that it was different. He did not know exactly what it was, or how old it was, or what it meant, but he knew, with the instinct that comes from 20 years of turning over the ground of this city, that it was not ordinary. He stopped digging. He called the site foreman. The site foreman called the developer's archaeologist, who happened to be on site that day. The archaeologist climbed down into the trench, looked at what the worker had found, and stood very still for a moment before reaching for his radio. What they had found was a piece of worked stone. Not a tool in the conventional sense, not a hand axe or a scraper or anything whose function was immediately recognizable as utilitarian. It was a piece of limestone, roughly shaped, bearing on one of its faces a series of marks that were clearly intentional, clearly organized according to some principle, and clearly very old. The stone was removed carefully, it was documented, it was analyzed. The analysis determined that the stone was Neolithic in date, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years old. The marks on its surface were not decorative in any obvious sense. They were not the geometric patterns associated with Neolithic art at other British sites. They were more irregular than that, but also more deliberate, more considered. They looked, to the archaeologists who examined them, like a record of some kind. Not a record in any writing system known to them, but a record in the broader sense of a set of marks placed with intention, organized according to a logic that the stone's maker understood, even if its subsequent finders did not. The stone was eventually deposited with the Museum of London and placed in the study collection, where it remains accessible to researchers but has never been put on public display. It has been written about in a small number of specialist publications, where it is noted as an unusual find and discussed with appropriate uncertainty. No consensus has been reached about what the marks mean or what purpose the stone served. The possibilities raised include a tally of some kind, recording numbers of animals or objects or days, a symbolic object associated with ritual activity, a map or spatial record of some kind, or simply a product of individual human creativity whose specific meaning died with its maker and is not recoverable from the object itself. The stone is not the most dramatic object ever found beneath London. It is not the most valuable or the most beautiful or the most informative in a straightforward factual sense, but it is one of the most haunting. A Neolithic human living in the Thames Valley 5,000 or 6,000 years ago picked up a piece of stone and made marks on it that they considered meaningful enough to retain, to keep, to carry, or to bury at a location that was apparently significant to them. That stone, with its marks, its record of an intention we cannot fully understand, its 5,000 years of waiting in the ground beneath what would become the financial capital of the world, contains something irreducible and important. It contains the evidence of a mind at work, a mind making meaning, a mind doing the thing that minds do, imposing order on the chaos of experience, leaving a record of that order for whatever comes after. The mind that made those marks could not have imagined what came after. It could not have imagined the Roman basilica that would eventually be built a few hundred meters away, or the Saxon church that replaced it, or the medieval marketplace that grew up around that church, or the Victorian banking houses that replaced the marketplace, or the glass tower that now stands where those banking houses stood. It could not have imagined the city, but it left something in the ground that the city has preserved, without knowing it, across 5,000 years of continuous occupation and continuous building and continuous change. And now, the city, through the medium of the archaeologist and the researcher and the writer and the reader, is returning the favor, is trying to understand what was meant by those marks, is trying to give them back a context in which they make sense. This is the conversation. This is what the archaeology of London ultimately is. A conversation across time between the people who left things in the ground and the people who are finding them. The objects are the medium of the conversation. The archaeologists are the translators. And the conversation is about something that matters, something that goes beyond the academic interest of a specialist field, something that speaks to questions that all of us carry. Who were we before we were this? What did we make, and why? How long have we been here, and what does that length of time mean? These are not questions that archaeology can answer completely, but they are questions that archaeology makes possible to ask with greater specificity, greater grounding in evidence, greater connection to the actual material record of actual human lives than any other discipline. And London, of all the places in Britain, of all the places in the world with a long and densely documented human past, is perhaps the place where those questions can be asked with the greatest force and the greatest reward. Because London's past is so deep, because London has been human for so long, because the ground beneath London contains so much, and because so many people are actively engaged in the work of finding it and understanding it and making it available to the rest of us. When the next big discovery comes, and it will come, because the city never stops revealing itself, because the construction projects continue and the foreshore keeps exposing new material and the analytical techniques keep improving and the grey literature keeps accumulating and the picture keeps getting richer and more complex and more surprising. When the next discovery comes, it will be one more piece of a story that is already extraordinary and that keeps becoming more extraordinary with every addition. The question is whether we are ready to hear it, Whether we are ready to accept that the story of this place does not begin with the Romans, does not begin with any recorded period, but extends back into a past and so deep and so dark that we are only beginning to find the tools to illuminate it. Whether we are ready to let London be what the evidence says it is, not just a 2,000-year-old city, but a 500,000-year-old human landscape, shaped by forces and inhabited by people across a span of time that makes the entire written history of civilization look like a recent addition to something vast and old and still mostly unknown. The answer, for those of us who pay attention to what is coming out of the ground beneath this city, is yes. We are ready. We are listening. And the ground has more to tell us than we have yet had the patience to hear. The city does not know what it is resting on. But we are starting to find out. We are going deeper every year. We are reading the layers more carefully. We are translating the mute testimony of stone and bone and river-worn metal into language that can be shared and discussed and built upon. We are making progress, slow and painstaking and uncertain as that progress often is. And what we are finding, as we go deeper and read more carefully and translate with greater skill, is something that should change the way all of us think about this place. Not just the specialists, not just the archaeologists and the historians and the museum professionals. All of us who live here, or who have lived here, or who have ever stood on the banks of the Thames and looked at the river running between its embankments and felt something that is very hard to name, something that is more than just an aesthetic response to a beautiful urban waterway, something that feels like recognition, like the activation of a response that goes deeper than personal memory, deeper than cultural conditioning, all the way down to something biological, something in the nervous system, something ancient. The river is very old, the place is very old, the human relationship with this place is very old, and the things that scientists keep finding beneath London are telling us, over and over again, in the language of objects and deposits and stratigraphic sequences and carbon dates, that the old is not gone, that it is still here, that it is right beneath our feet, and that the story it tells is not finished, it is never finished. The tide turns. The foreshore is exposed again. The mudlark walks slowly along the edge of the river in the grey morning light, eyes on the ground, reading what the water has left. And somewhere in the mud, something is waiting to be found. Something that has been waiting for a very long time. Something that, when it is found and cleaned and analyzed and understood, will add another sentence to the longest story in the history of this place. The story of the people who were here before, all of them, for longer than we have yet been willing to say. If this journey through the deep time of London has kept you company tonight, if it has helped you feel the weight of all those years and all those lives beneath the modern city, then it has done what it was meant to do. You can let the images settle now. The Thames in the interglacial, the Bronze Age fire on the riverbank, the Roman basilica rising above the older layers, the Saxon settlement taking shape in the ruins' shadow, the medieval city growing upward and outward, the mudlark on the foreshore at dawn, reading what the river has left. All of it is there. All of it is real. All of it is still in the ground beneath the city, still waiting, still speaking in the slow language of the very old to anyone who has the patience to listen. And if you are still listening now, if your eyes are growing heavy and the words are beginning to blur and the boundary between this and sleep is becoming pleasantly indistinct, then you have heard something tonight that is worth carrying with you into whatever comes next. We were here, all of us. We were always here. The river knows. There are tunnels beneath London that nobody uses anymore. Not the famous ones, not the ones that the tourist literature celebrates, not the ones that appear on the maps handed out to visitors at the stations of the London Underground. There are tunnels that were built for purposes that no longer apply, that were sealed up when those purposes became obsolete, that have been sitting in the darkness for decades or longer. slowly accruing moisture and fungi and the slow geological process that turns engineered spaces back into nature if you leave them alone long enough. These tunnels are not secret, exactly. They are known about. They appear in engineering records. Some of them have been explored by the people who make a hobby of exploring the inaccessible infrastructure of cities, the urban spelunkers who document these spaces and share their photographs online. But they are not part of the London that most people know. They are part of the London beneath the London, the city under the city, the infrastructure that supports the surface without being seen by the people it supports. And in some of these tunnels, and in the spaces adjacent to them, archaeologists have found things that the original tunnel builders found and moved aside, or left in place, or sealed around, without fully understanding what they were looking at. Things that have been sitting in the dark beneath the dark city for a very long time. In 2004, an investigation of a Victorian service tunnel in the area near the Bank of England, one of the periodic inspections that the tunnel's owners conduct to assess its structural condition, found at one point along its course a section of wall that was clearly not part of the Victorian structure. The Victorian tunnel had been cut through an earlier building, and the wall of that earlier building had been incorporated into the fabric of the tunnel, sealed in and built around and left in the dark. The wall was made of stone, not London brick, which would have been the normal building material for a structure of the post-medieval period. Stone, cut stone, laid in courses, with a character that suggested considerable age. The investigation team noted the wall and moved on. Their job was to assess the structural condition of the tunnel, not to conduct an archaeological investigation. They reported the wall in their findings as an anomaly, and their report was eventually filed and forgotten in the way that such reports are. Years later, an archaeologist reviewing the maintenance records of Victorian infrastructure in the City of London as part of a broader research project encountered the report and recognized that the description of the wall was consistent with medieval construction, possibly earlier. She made inquiries. She traced the location, and she eventually arranged for a small team to enter the tunnel and examine the wall more carefully. The examination confirmed that the wall was genuinely medieval in character, possibly dating to the 13th or 14th century. It incorporated materials of earlier date, including what appeared to be reused Roman tile, a common practice in medieval construction, where earlier building material was recycled rather than quarried fresh. The wall appeared to be the remains of a structure that had been built over and over and over again on the same site, each rebuilding incorporating elements of the previous structure, until the Victorian tunnel had finally sealed the whole thing into the darkness of the subsurface. The wall in the dark tunnel, beneath the surface of the city, above the layers that contained the Roman and pre-Roman archaeology, was a kind of compressed summary of the whole story of London. The reuse, the rebuilding, the accumulation, the layering, everything on top of everything else, everything containing traces of what came before. The investigation produced a short report. The report was submitted to the relevant archaeological database. The wall is now documented. It has been added to the record, and the tunnel continues to be a tunnel, and the wall continues to sit in the dark, and the city above it continues to function without knowing it is there. This is the archaeology of London in microcosm. Most of it is never seen. Most of it is never thought about by the people who walk above it. It is simply there, doing its silent work of existing, of persisting, of being the ground on which everything else stands. But some people are paying attention. Some people are watching the ground. Some people understand that the city is not just what you can see above the surface, that it has depth and that the depth matters, that the depth is part of what makes it what it is. Among those people are the staff and volunteers of the Thames Discovery Programme, an organisation that trains foreshore recorders to systematically document the archaeological material exposed on the Thames foreshore at low tide. These are not professional archaeologists for the most part. They are trained volunteers, people with a wide variety of day jobs and backgrounds who have been taught to recognize and record the kinds of material that appear on the foreshore and to submit their records to the Thames Discovery Programme database, which is maintained by the Museum of London and which is one of the most comprehensive records of material culture from the Thames foreshore that has ever existed. The programme was established in 2008, and in the years since its founding, its volunteers have submitted tens of thousands of records. These records cover material from every period of human activity on the Thames, from prehistoric to post-medieval, and they are building up a picture of the distribution and character of foreshore material that would have been impossible to create without the systematic contribution of large numbers of observers working across the full length of the foreshore within Greater London. What the programme's database is beginning to reveal is exactly the kind of pattern that the archaeological literature has been suggesting for decades: a non-random distribution of material that reflects the underlying geography of the foreshore, the locations of buried features such as ancient embankments and jetties and timber structures, and the effects of specific human activities at specific locations across many centuries. The density of prehistoric material at certain foreshore locations, for example, corresponds well with the known locations of river crossings and with the known distribution of votive deposits in the river. The distribution of Roman material reflects the known extent of the Roman riverfront and the known locations of Roman wharfing and warehousing. The medieval material is concentrated in areas that correspond to known medieval riverside development. But the programme's database also contains anomalies, locations where the material does not correspond to anything in the existing archaeological record, concentrations of material in areas where no significant archaeological activity was previously known, isolated finds of objects that do not fit any known type or period and that resist attribution to any known context. These anomalies are the most interesting entries in the database, the most potentially significant, the most deserving of follow-up investigation. They are the places where the foreshore is saying something that the existing record has not yet said, and where the conversation between the present and the past is producing something genuinely new. The Thames foreshore is being lost. This is another dimension of the London story that is not widely enough known. The foreshore is being eroded. The combination of rising sea levels, increased wave action from river traffic, and the effects of the hard embanking of the Thames in the Victorian period, which altered the natural erosion and deposition processes of the river, is causing the foreshore to become thinner and more depleted every year. Material that was buried in the foreshore sediments, protected and preserved for centuries, is now being exposed and washed away before it can be found and recorded. The foreshore is, in the most literal sense, disappearing beneath our feet. The implications for the archaeological record are significant. Much of what remains to be found in the Thames foreshore is, by definition, in the process of being destroyed. The race between discovery and loss is real, and it is urgent. The Thames Discovery Programme's volunteers are part of the effort to win that race, or at least to slow the rate at which the race is being lost. By systematically recording what they find, by documenting the distribution and character of foreshore material before it disappears, they are creating a record that will be of value to researchers long after the objects themselves are gone. But recording is not the same as recovering. A photographic record of an object that has been washed into the river tells you something, but it does not preserve the context, the relationship between the object and the deposit it came from, the stratigraphic associations that allow an archaeologist to understand when the object was deposited and under what circumstances. Context is what gives objects their meaning in archaeological terms. An object without context is a curiosity. An object in context is evidence. And the context of the Thames foreshore is being eroded away along with the objects themselves. This loss is irreversible. What the Thames takes back does not give back. The objects that wash off the foreshore and disperse into the river, currents are gone, definitively and permanently. The story they could have told is lost. This is not a recent problem. The Thames has been losing foreshore material for as long as human beings have been doing things near it that have left material traces. But the rate of loss is accelerating, and the recognition of that acceleration has prompted an urgency in the work of foreshore recording and investigation that was not always present in earlier decades. The sense of urgency is appropriate. It is a rational response to a real situation. But it is also worth noting that the urgency itself is part of the story, that the awareness of loss and the effort to mitigate it are also human activities taking place in this landscape at this moment in time, and that they are, in a very real sense, continuous with all the other human activities that this landscape has witnessed across the long span of its human history. The mudlark on the foreshore today, systematically recording what she finds with a waterproof notebook and a GPS device and a smartphone camera, is doing something that is continuous with the Bronze Age person who stood at the water's edge and recognized this as a place of significance. Not the same thing, not the same motivation, not the same cultural framework, not the same understanding of what the river is and what it means, but continuous in the sense that both are engaging with the same river in the same landscape, both finding in it something that demands attention and response, both contributing to a relationship between human beings and this particular stretch of water that is very old and that shows no signs of ending. The relationship between London and the Thames is the deepest and oldest thread in the city's history. It predates the city by hundreds of thousands of years. It will, in all likelihood, outlast the city by whatever timescale the future decides to assign to such things. The river was here before the city. The river will be here after the city. And in between, the river has been the constant around which everything else has organized itself, the fixed point in a landscape of constant change, the element of the environment that has most consistently and most powerfully shaped the human activity of this place across the full span of that activity. Understanding London means understanding the Thames, and understanding the Thames means understanding it not just as a modern waterway, managed and embanked and channeled and monitored, but as an ancient river, as a geological feature that has been shaping this landscape for millions of years, as a presence in the human experience of this corner of the world that goes back as far as the human experience itself. The things that scientists keep finding beneath London are, almost without exception, connected to the Thames in some way. The Paleolithic tools are in the Thames gravels. The Bronze Age metalwork is in the Thames. The Roman structures are on the Thames riverfront. The Saxon Londonwich was a Thames-side trading town. The medieval city was organized around the Thames. The modern city is shaped by the Thames. The river is the constant. Everything else is a function of the relationship with the river. And the river is speaking through the objects it yields and through the landscape it has shaped, and through the foreshore it exposes at every low tide, a language that we are still learning to read. The archaeologists are the linguists. The foreshore recorders are the field workers. The construction crews who find things in the ground and call it in, rather than covering it over, are the informants. The researchers who spend their careers analyzing specific categories of material from specific periods are the specialists who translate particular vocabularies. And the readers, the people who follow the story of what is being found beneath London, with interest and attention, and a willingness to revise their understanding of what this place is and what it has been, They are the audience for whom the translation is being made. It is worth being that audience. It is worth paying attention to what the ground is saying. Because what it is saying is extraordinary, and because it is a story about us, about all of us, about the full length and depth of human time in this landscape. And that is a story whose significance goes well beyond the boundaries of any specialist field, or any academic discipline, or any national history. It is part of the human story, the deep human story, the story of who we are and where we came from and how long we have been finding particular places good and returning to them across spans of time that exceed our capacity for direct imagination. London is one of those places. The Thames is the reason, and the things in the ground are the evidence. Listen to what the ground is saying. The river knows. On the night that this script is being read, somewhere in London, someone is underground. They might be on the tube, the night service running between stations through tunnels that were bored through the same geology that contains the archaeological layers, that pass within meters of the Bronze Age and the Roman and the medieval remains, without anyone on the train being aware of the proximity. They might be in a basement car park beneath one of the glass towers of the financial district, walking to their car without noticing that the concrete beneath their feet is resting on fill, that is resting on the debris of 2,000 years of human occupation. They might be in one of the utility tunnels that thread through the substructure of the city, maintaining the infrastructure that the surface depends on, moving through the dark with headlamps and hard hats and the professional assurance of people who know what they are doing. None of them are thinking about what is around them. None of them are listening to what the ground is saying. They are thinking about where they are going and what they will find when they get there and what they need to do next. This is entirely reasonable. People cannot be archaeologists all the time. The city would not function if its inhabitants were constantly stopping to contemplate the depth of what they are walking over. The surface has its own demands, its own urgencies, its own claims on the attention of the people who live in it. But somewhere, at this same moment, there is almost certainly someone who is paying attention. A foreshore recorder out at low tide, even in the dark, using a torch to scan the mud for the glint of metal or the distinctive texture of ancient pottery. An archaeologist on a night shift at a construction site, because the work does not stop, and neither does the archaeological watching brief. A researcher sitting at a desk in the city, with the grey literature of London archaeology spread around them, working their way through the reports of excavations conducted at sites across the route of a new development, building up a picture of what is there and what it means and how it fits into the larger story. These people are doing something that matters. They are keeping the conversation open. They are making sure that the ground has an opportunity to say what it has to say, that the objects in the earth have someone to be found by, that the long story of this place has someone to listen to it and pass it on. The story deserves passing on. 500,000 years of human time in the Thames Valley. The evidence of a human presence in this landscape, going back further than the standard account of London's history, begins to acknowledge the persistent significance of certain places, the repeated return to the same locations across spans of time that exceed any cultural tradition, the mute testimony of objects and deposits and features that speak of the full range of what human beings do and have done and will go on doing in this particular corner of the world. The city above is real. The city above is impressive and complex and extraordinary in its own right. But the city below is older and stranger, and in some ways more astonishing, because the city below contains the evidence of all the people who were here before the city existed, who could not have imagined what would grow up over their lives and their deaths and their sacred places and their everyday activities, who left things in the ground that have persisted through everything that has happened since, and that are still being found, still being understood, still being incorporated into the story that this place keeps telling about itself. That story is not finished. It will never be finished, as long as there are people, and as long as there is ground, and as long as the two retain their ancient relationship of coexistence and mutual shaping. The city will keep building, and the ground will keep receiving what the city builds, and the time will keep accumulating, and the layers will keep deepening, and the archaeologists will keep digging, and the foreshore recorders will keep watching, and the things that have been in the ground will keep surfacing, and the story will keep being told. Listen to it. It is worth listening to. The darkness beneath London is not empty. It is full. It is full of time. It is full of people. It is full of objects and features and deposits and all the material evidence of everything that has ever been done in this place by every human being who has ever lived here or passed through or stopped for a while and found it good. All of that is still there. All of it is still speaking. And the question that the scientists keep asking, the question that each new finding beneath London keeps opening rather than closing, is the question of how much more is down there that we have not yet found, how many more layers there are to read, how much more the ground has to tell us before it has told us everything. The honest answer is that we do not know. We may never know. The depth of the record exceeds our capacity to fully investigate it. The rate of loss competes with the rate of discovery. The interpretive frameworks we have may be inadequate to the full complexity of what the evidence contains. But we are trying, we are paying attention, we are listening to what the ground is saying, and we are doing our best to understand it and to pass it on. The city does not know what it is resting on, but we are finding out, one object at a time, one layer at a time, one carbon date at a time, one conversation at a time between the archaeologist and the deposit, between the present and the deep past, between the city as it is and the landscape it grew from. The conversation is ongoing. The river is still running, the tide is still turning, and the ground still has more to say. There is one more thing worth saying before we let the darkness take us. Something that does not fit neatly into the archaeological narrative. Something that is harder to document and harder to analyze, but that feels true in a way that the material evidence supports without being able to fully articulate. When you stand on the bank of the Thames at certain moments, at dawn before the city wakes, or at dusk when the light is going and the water has turned the color of pewter, or late at night when the surface of the river reflects the lights of the city in long, broken columns of orange and yellow and white, there is a feeling that is very difficult to name. It is a feeling that has something to do with time, with the weight of time, with the sense of the river as something that has been doing this, running through this landscape, reflecting the available light, carrying whatever the current brings it, for longer than any mind can properly grasp. People have stood here before, hundreds of thousands of people, over hundreds of thousands of years. They have stood at the water's edge and looked out over the river and felt something. We cannot know exactly what they felt, but we can know that they felt something, because the things they left in the river, the things they threw into the water or placed at its edge or deposited in its mud, are the material expression of a feeling that demanded response, a feeling that said, this place matters, this river matters. Something is happening here that is more than just water flowing to the sea. What was that feeling? Was it fear, awe, gratitude, the recognition of power in something larger and older and more enduring than any individual human life? Was it the specific feeling that comes from standing at a boundary, at the edge between one kind of space and another, between the land and the water, between the known and the unknown, between this side and the other side? We cannot know, but we can feel, if we pay close enough attention, something of what they might have felt, because the river is still there, the boundary is still there. The experience of standing at the water's edge and looking out over a current that has been running since before human memory is still available, still possible, still capable of producing in the human nervous system a response that goes beyond the intellectual and into something older and less easily categorized. This is the deepest gift of the deep past of London. Not just the information, not just the correction of the standard narrative, the extension of the timeline, the enrichment of the story, but the connection, the sense of being continuous with all the people who were here before, of standing in a line that stretches back through the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Paleolithic and the interglacials to the very beginning of human presence in this landscape, of sharing with all of those people the same fundamental experience, standing by this river, finding it significant, feeling that significance in a way that the body knows even when the mind cannot fully articulate. The archaeologists will keep digging, the foreshore recorders will keep watching, the scientists will keep analyzing and dating and interpreting the things that come up from the ground. The story will keep being told and retold and extended and complicated, and the river will keep running, as it has always run, as it will always run. Through the landscape that has been human for 500,000 years, and that will be human in whatever form that takes, for as long as human beings and rivers coexist on this planet. The tide turns, the foreshore is exposed, the morning light comes across the water, and somewhere in the mud, something is waiting to be found that has been waiting for a very long time, something that will add another sentence, another paragraph, another chapter to the longest story in the history of this place. We are still writing it. We will always be still writing it. And that, in the end, is what it means to live in a city that has been human since before civilization. That is what it means to walk streets that are laid over layers of time that go back further than any written record can follow. That is what it means to share a landscape with 500,000 years of human history, to be the latest inhabitants of a place that has always mattered to the people who found themselves here. It means that the story is never finished. It means that every excavation is a new sentence, every foreshore find is a new word, every analysis, every date, every careful reading of the stratigraphic record is another step deeper into a text that is longer and stranger and richer than anything any individual writer has ever produced. We are all part of that text now. By paying attention, by listening to what the ground is saying, by caring about the deep past of this place and the people who inhabited it, we are adding ourselves to the conversation. We are becoming part of the story that the ground tells about the full length of human time in this landscape. That is a good place to be. That is a story worth being part of. The ground goes on. The conversation goes on. And the things that scientists keep finding beneath London will keep rewriting everything we know, layer by layer, object by object, until the rewriting itself becomes part of the history. Another chapter in the longest story ever told in this particular place. We were here, all of us, for longer than we have yet understood, and the ground remembers all of it. Every single moment, every single life, every single thing that was ever left in the earth or thrown into the river or built on the bank or buried in the clay by anyone who've stood in this landscape and found it worth stopping in. The ground remembers, and it is still telling us what it knows. Listen. The city breathes. Above the ground, the buses run their routes, and the office lights burn late into the night, and the markets open and close, and the river reflects whatever sky is above it. Below the ground, the layers wait, patient, ancient, indifferent to the urgency of the surface, holding the record of everything that has ever happened here in the slow, permanent way that only geology can manage. Somewhere between those two worlds, in the narrow zone where the surface meets the depth, where the present is touching the past, the work continues. The trowel moves carefully through the clay. The brush sweeps the debris from the face of an exposed deposit. The camera records, the notebook fills. The conversation between the archaeologist and the ground goes on, sentence by careful sentence, adding to the total of what is known. And the total of what is known keeps growing. And the story keeps becoming more extraordinary. And the city keeps not knowing what it is resting on, while the people who do know keep trying to tell it, keep finding new ways to translate the language of the ground into words that the surface can hear. The ground is speaking. It has always been speaking. It will always be speaking. We just have to learn to listen. That is the invitation that the deep past of London extends to anyone willing to accept it. Not to become an archaeologist, though the world could always use more of those. Not to abandon the surface and its demands, but simply to remember occasionally. When you cross a bridge over the Thames, or walk through the streets of the old city, or stand for a moment on a piece of ground that feels, for reasons you cannot entirely explain, like it has something to say to you, that you are standing on time. A very great deal of time, more time than the standard story of this place accounts for, more time than most of us have ever been invited to consider. 500,000 years. That is what is beneath London. That is what the scientists keep finding, and the finding is never done. This city has always been more than it appears. It has always had depth that the surface does not reveal. And the depth is there, beneath your feet, beneath the pavements and the foundations, and the Victorian tunnels, and the Roman layers, and all the centuries of human activity that have compressed themselves into the geology of this place, waiting with the extraordinary patience of the very old for the moment when someone looks down instead of up, and listens instead of speaks, and learns, to hear what the ground has been saying all along. The ground is always speaking. This is London. This is what lies beneath it. And the finding is never finished.